Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss, and this week's episode is with the charming and eloquent and delightful writer journalist Douglas Murray. I fell in love with Douglas's writing from his books. The first book I read, The Madness of Crowds, and then War on the West more recently. And the writing in there touched topics that are near and dear to both of us. And then I got to know him personally and found him even more delightful than his writing, and then discovered a different facet of Douglas Murray. Recently, he writes a segment each week for Free Press on poetry that he is committed to memory and the importance of that, and discusses some of the greatest poets around. And I loved listening to them, and of course share his interest in at least a few of the poets. And I asked him to bookend this episode. We began this episode and ended it with poetry, which is why I call this episode From Poetry to Free Speech. We began with the sublime poetry and then moved to the ridiculousness of the modern world, the attacks on free speech, rationality, classical liberalism, as you might call it. And Douglas and I come from different ends of the political spectrum, but we share a concern about the attacks on literally the Enlightenment. And we talked about all the things you probably shouldn't talk about when you go home for Thanksgiving, from gender to race to identity, feminism, postmodernism, and many other isms, and the events that are going on in the world that have us both concerned about not just free speech, but democracy in general. So I hope you will be as enthralled listening to this as I was talking to Douglas Murray. And you can watch it ad-free if you subscribe to our Critical Mass Substack site, and those subscription fees go to support the Origins Project Foundation, the nonprofit foundation that produces this podcast and other activities that are where we try and bring science and culture together. Or you can watch it for free on YouTube, or listen to it on any podcast listening site. Regardless of how you watch it or listen to it, I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did, and I hope you'll be as enthralled and captivated by Douglas Murray as I continue to be. With no further ado, Douglas Murray. Well, Douglas, thank you so much for coming on. I've wanted to have you on for so long, and all that's happened since I first planned to get you on is I've been reading more and more of your stuff and enjoying it more and more, so we'll go longer and longer.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
It's a great pleasure. I'm so glad we could finally make this work.
Yeah, me too. Me too. It's great, and this reminds me of probably you don't remember the TV show Green Acres, which was a show about a guy from New York who moved to a small town, but it's like you're in New York and I'm in here in the middle of nowhere. It's perfect. But I want to begin actually with your voice, and before we totally change gears. So I'm going to play this, which I hope will be audible in this video. So we'll try it.
My prime of youth is but a frost of cares. Here's but a dish of pain. My crop of corn is but a field of tares, and all my good is but vain hope of gain. The day is fled, and yet I saw no sun. And now I live, and now my life is done. The spring is past, and yet it hath not sprung. The fruit is dead, and yet the leaves be green. My youth is gone, and yet I am but young. I saw the world, and yet I was not seen. My thread is cut, and yet it is not spun. And now I live, and now my life is done. I sought my death, and found it in my womb. I looked for life, and saw it was a shade. I trod the earth, and knew it was my tomb. And now I die, and now I am but made. The glass is full, and now my glass is run. And now I live, and now my life is done.
There we go. Well, that was beautiful. And there's two things I'll say about that. First of all, it comes from a column you write for Free Press every week called Things Worth Remembering, about poetry worth remembering. So first I was going to put you on the spot and have you recite it from memory, but I thought better not, because I had a recording of you saying it, and I'd also thought of reading it, but I when I listened to your reading it, reminds me of having talked to my friend Stephen Fry, who I would rather hear read the phone book than hear me do anything. But it was just beautiful, and I assume that it is committed to memory. One of the things that this column is about is not just the beauty of poetry and the impact it has on you, but the reason to memorize it, which is interesting because I'm terrible at memorizing poetry. I know my friend Richard Dawkins loves to recite poetry when we're together, and it's lovely. It's not only enjoyable to listen to, but it makes one seem oh so refined as well. When and I remember when I was a kid, I had to learn poetry. I remember performing Macbeth, in fact, when I was about 12. But boy, it is lovely to have that. And this comes from Tichborne's Lament, which was a. Well, why don't you introduce a little bit?
Yes, it was, I think, the fifth week of columns. This is a wonderful idea of Barry Weiss. She came to me some time ago, and she was setting up the Free Press, and she said, "I'd like you to do a column for me." And I said, "Well, I do sort of 3 or 4 columns every week." And I mean, I'm fortunate in that the world keeps on giving me a lot of material.
Yeah.
But I said I'm not quite sure I've got another one in me. And she said, "No, I want you to do about something totally different." And it was actually her idea. She said, "I've heard you over the dinner table, as it were, sometimes in your cups, reciting things you seem to pluck out of nowhere. And I know you've got a lot of poetry in your head, a lot of quotations, a lot of prose as well by heart. And maybe you would write each week about why there's something you have in your head and why you have it there." And I thought that was just such a brilliant idea. I don't think I'd have come up with it myself.
It really is lovely.
It's a great editor's insight, that. And I've been doing it, and I've just loved it because, first of all, of course, it's a great change of pace.
Yeah.
Which, as you know, I mean, sometimes the old line about a change being as good as the rest is absolutely true, particularly for writing. But yes, really, it's about something which I learned when I was, or at least learned is the wrong word. I intuited when I was quite young that it was worth having a lot of stuff up here if you could lodge it there. And as I actually said in the first column in this series, which is about Pasternak and Shakespeare, I learned actually from the great polymath George Steiner, who died some years ago, a great Cambridge intellectual of the 20th century. And I once heard him lecture when I was a schoolboy, and it just made a huge impression on me. And he said, relating a story I related about Pasternak and the Writers' Conference in Moscow in 1937, I remember Steiner saying, "What you have up here, the bastards can't take."
Yeah, yep.
They can take most of us. Maybe they'll try to take all of us, but they can't take everything. They can't take the language. They can't take the poetry. What we have in our heads, they can't actually take. And for some reason, I always found that a very moving idea, that we need things in our heads that travel around with us as we live. And the funny thing is, of course, is the era we live in. I was writing about this recently in a different column. The era we live in has this oddity, doesn't it? I mean, you mentioned, Lawrence, that when you were a boy, you were taught things by rote. That's one very good way to put people off poetry, of course.
Well, actually, I enjoyed the experience, but I didn't maintain it.
Some people do. I mean, some time ago, I was speaking at a conference of teachers, and I mentioned something about the importance of learning things by heart. And this teacher said, "I was taught T.S. Eliot by heart when I was a boy, and I've hated him ever since." And I said, "Well, it might be your fault, not T.S. Eliot's." But anyway, but the point, but I do understand it. Some people sort of get put off for life, and also they think, "Well, I don't want this." But my point is, find the things that you would want to furnish your memory with. Find the ones that you could do with, and you'll find that they crop up in your life at strange times, often, but that you'll need this stuff. And we used to call it a well-furnished brain.
Yeah.
I'm not saying mine's by any means the best furnished, not by a very long way, but I have a sort of attic-like
Yeah.
brain, and personally, it's been an enormous solace and inspiration to me in my life. There've been many times I relayed in the second column in this series about T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, I was going to say T.S. Eliot and Terry Waite.
Yes. I mean, that was another one that made an impression on me, with Terry Waite, who was a hostage in Lebanon for many years, who I also heard speaking when I was younger, saying that, after being chained to a radiator in a Beirut cell and dungeon for years, he wasn't entirely alone, because he had what was in his head. And he had in his head, among other things, the four quartets of T.S. Eliot.
One of my favorite poems. Well, in fact, I think I wrote you after that to tell you, and we'll get to T.S. Eliot, but far later, because T.S. Eliot is one of my favorite poets. I don't have many favorite poets. I should say that I'm a Philistine in many ways, or at least provocative. And I once got in trouble when I was at a position at Harvard in something called the Society of Fellows, and one of the senior fellows was one of the world's experts on poetry and Shakespeare. And I said to provoke her one day, I said, if poets have something to say, why don't they just write it down? And she never talked to me for 3 years after that. But my problem with poetry when I was, it is true that English classes turn people off reading and writing almost more than anything else in school. And, and I've always loved reading and writing, but it turned me off poetry for a long time, because what I hated was the incessant interpretation, the incessant need to try and go into the writer's head and decide what they were talking about. I liked the sound of poetry, and I like thinking about it myself and how it resonates with me. But I've never liked trying to get inside the head of an author in terms of trying to understand what they're and so that incessant need to analyze poetry instead of just enjoying it.
I agree. At some point, it's like being shown how a piano works, rather than just listening to someone play it.
Yeah, for me, that's okay. I don't mind that so much. It's like Feynman once saying that knowing how a rainbow works doesn't make it less exciting. It makes it more exciting. And I think that. But trying to constantly look for hidden meanings. And what the intent of the author was is something it may have been beyond me. Well, I mean, I could do it, but I never trusted it.
No, it's a very common mistake in teaching. The piano analogy is only give it only works if you did that to someone who'd never heard of piano being played.
Yeah, exactly.
And so a lot of teaching of literature, for instance, is, I remember once I had a very bad teacher teaching King Lear. And, we did the first line. What can we learn from this line? And, like this. And I remember thinking, I just want to know how the play goes, because I'm fairly sure it's going to go badly for everyone.
Exactly. That's probably why I fell in love with Shakespeare, who, of course, the poet, because I was in some class when I was age 11, and we performed and had to memorize Macbeth. Yes. And I turned out to be Macbeth, mostly because I was the only boy who was willing to wear tights. And it was just a life-changing experience in so many ways. And it was just a joy, because in performing it, you have to think about it, obviously. But the poet, the reason I started with this, which is first of all, it's a lovely poem, and it's your most recent one, your most recent column, but it does share in spirit what you talked about from Steiner and from Waite, and which is the fact that the Gedanken sind frei, that our thoughts are free, that what's in our heads is always ours, and it brings to mind. And so this was written before this young man who was awaiting execution the next morning and was executed, and there's a long tradition of that, and it brought to mind to me two things that it's not all such great writing has been poetry. The two things that resonated with me that were very similar were, I guess, when I first learned about Boethius's famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, who wrote a whole book about the consolation of philosophy, waiting for a year to be executed in a horrific way. And that really had an impact on me, that even in the worst of times, philosophy ideas are yours, and you can get great consolation, and as well as in in writing the poetry, or as in the case of Terry Waite, the beauty of listening to or remembering a T.S. Eliot. And there's another one, I mean, a much more American case, because we were working on a movie about Thomas Paine, and The Age of Reason, which is his famous book, of course, was written when he was imprisoned in France during the French Revolution, again awaiting execution, and almost executed except for a small accident and the death of Robespierre. But both of those things, in my own time, not just poetry, but the realization that writing and thinking take you through even the worst of times have had a tremendous impact on me personally. I don't know if they have for you as a writer, a fellow writer.
I think so, and I think that it's also worth pointing out that it signals something that's extraordinarily unique to us as human beings. This urge. I mean, what species would think of writing a 3-stanza poem on the scaffold?
Yeah, exactly.
Something. There's something that tells you something extraordinarily deep about what we are as human beings, that impulse would even be there. Because among other things, I mean, you know, I'm a great fan of G.H. Hardy's Mathematician's Apology.
Yeah.
Hardy says there that he says immortality is perhaps a foolish word, but if it belongs to anyone, it probably belongs to the mathematician. And he makes the rather beautiful observation that he says the calculuses of Archimedes will survive the praise of Euripides, not because they speak of the truth, but because they are true. And this, of course, is a great warning shot to poets from a mathematician. But nevertheless, whether or not Hardy's correct, it is that impulse even till the end to say I will leave something, I will communicate, I will try to communicate beyond this. That is a human instinct which is, thank God, is ineradicable from us.
Yeah, I think so, and it comes out in different people in different ways. You know, obviously, I think you and I as writers hope our writing in some ways will outlive us, but I'm happy to have a hat as a scientist and recognize and like to think that you know, winds change, and we'll talk about that, and society changes, but the realities of the universe we may be expanded upon, but fundamental insights don't go away, and it's just a very it's a very satisfying thing for me to think that the contributions made to science will be there, independent of my writing or other things. Look, Barry's brilliance in having you do this, and now for something completely different column, was not lost on me, and I wanted to begin with poetry, and I promise we're going to end with poetry 8 or 10 hours from now, but I want it because we are going to dive into from the heights of the human intellect and the human experience. We're going to dive down to the lowest parts, and we're going to go from the sublime to the ridiculous, and which you've written a lot about, and so do I. As you say, there's lots of fodder for columns all the time because of it. And you know, I first got to know of you because of your writing about commentary about things that were ridiculous, and I want to get there. And I mean, and I want to focus eventually on your two last beautiful books, both of which, you know, they're books I read and where I used to do this with my friend my late friend Christopher Hitchens, where I'd read it almost every page. I go, yes, and that's great because, by the way, both in the case with him and in you, although I think even in more of a case with you, our politics are in many ways quite different, and it's wonderful that we can have that convergence, and also I'm convinced we could have as we will hopefully a little bit later in the podcast, have a discussion of things we disagree with in a way which is fine, which is good, and should be and should happen more often. Christopher was one of the people who could get along, even though he was viewed as a bulldog, could get along better than anyone I ever knew with people who had a completely different worldview from him, and I was that had a big impact on me, trying to think about how.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I remember that he I mean, of course, he as you well know, at the lunch, in particular the dinner table, he, like Dr. Johnson, talked for victory.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I was always impressed by the fact that he once, one of my other great mentors growing up was Roger Scruton, the conservative philosopher, having Christopher, who was of course a leftist,
Yeah.
mainly, and Roger was two of my sort of great encouragers. Always caused a slight sort of dichotomy sometimes early on in my thinking. But I remember once telling Christopher that I'd just come from staying with Roger Scruton at his then farm in Virginia. I remember, and the only time I'd ever seen Christopher say anything mean about anything about Roger in print, it was very mean. And Christopher immediately said, "Oh, where are they living?" And I said, "Well, they're in Virginia." And he said, "I must drop them a line, look them up."
Yeah, exactly. I remember when he told, well, he was going to have before he died, he was planning yet another one of those dinners that would be filmed. And I was very happy and honored that he wanted me to be in it. And one of the people would have been Justice Scalia, with whom I disagree tremendously, and so does he. But that would have been and it would have been four people who had very different worldviews. And I wish one of them, I miss him for many reasons, but I would have loved to have had that event at that dinner. Well, look, I want to get to the madness of crowds and the war in the West, which are the two focus on issues I want to talk about before returning to poetry. But in fact, this is probably a unique podcast among all the ones that because I always begin with origins. In this case, I began with poetry because it was such a nice way of starting and listening to you. But I do want to begin with your origins because I'm fascinated in what gets people to where they are. Before we talk about where you are now. And I've done a little bit of research, and your mother was an English teacher, your father a civil servant, right? Is that correct? Now, who had a bigger impact? So you decided to study English. Was it the example of your mother, or was there a great encouragement when you're young to do reading and who among your parents had that kind of impact on you, or perhaps neither of them? Maybe it was just self-induced.
They were both very encouraging, enormously encouraging. I actually, music was my first love, and it was through music actually that I got interested in literature. Strangely, not the other way around. When I discovered the texts that various composers and others were setting, and realized I loved the texts,
Uh-huh.
and would read the other works. So it was a strange way in, perhaps, but. It's also one way of things being memorable is if they're also accompanied by music. But yes, music was really my first love. And it was through that I discovered all sorts of new worlds. And I was a scholarship boy, meaning that I sort of worked my way up through the schooling in the UK to see the full gamut, you might say, horror of education in the UK.
Well, I want to get to your educational experience, which I've heard you describe in rather interesting ways, and so.
But yes, and then really I had that thing which I'm pretty sure you and almost everyone watching has had at some point, which is at least one, if not in my case more, just transformative teachers who showed you the way to think rather than what to think. And it imbued me with the same intellectual curiosities that they had. And as I say, I mean, it's almost a sort of cliche to society, but it's a cliche because it's true.
Yeah, it's true. Teachers,
a transformative teacher is absolutely irreplaceable. And I cannot think of my life and how I've achieved or whatever I have achieved without that simple thing of certain people saying very memorable things at specific and important times.
Yeah, it's I've had that experience, but it's interesting as I've talked to people, I've discovered a lot of people haven't. There's at least 2 or 3 people I know who really of quite great accomplishment in different areas said nope, teachers had no impact on their lives, they got in the way, and it shocked me. But it's nice to know that nothing's universal in that sense. But yeah, great teachers, and in my while for me, interestingly enough, there were a few good science teachers, but mostly it was history and English for teachers that had that big impact for me. Even though
you can really, I mean, you can put somebody off a subject very
if
you're a bad teacher.
It's a lot easier to do bad than good. It's in the world in general, I think.
Absolutely. But yes, I mean, it's interesting to consider what the things are that we think of as being the signs of a good teacher. And I would say they're, among other things, having the humility to show the student that you don't know everything either.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, that whenever I saw that, I was knocked over.
That's the most exciting thing. And I've written my new book, which is in England is the known unknowns. But I say at the my first line that the thing I don't know is the most important thing you could do. And I certainly always say that teachers and parents should say that a lot, because it's an invitation to discover someone you think should know everything doesn't know. It means, hey, that we can learn this together. And it's really
that it's an endless journey.
Exactly.
Which is itself very important. I mean, the idea that one of my favorite quotes is from a man I had an enormous amount of respect for, and I never met. He died before I was about, but Alan Bloom.
Yeah, I know who he is. Of course, I read his book.
I was with one of his friends, Harvey Mansfield, the other day at Harvard, and I said to Harvey that there's a quote of Alan Bloom's which I adore. He gave the commencement address at Cornell at some point in the 80s, and he said to the students there, he said, these are your charmed years. they sit between the years of ignorance and the intellectual wastelands that most of us go into in adulthood. They do not waste these years. But of course, really, the aspiration of any student should also be not to go into an intellectual wasteland.
Of course,
Of course, it's a jibe to make you not go there.
Yeah, and it should be the aspiration of every teacher to, as we said, to teach how to learn, and make learning a lifelong activity, whether you're an academic or whatever you do. And it's interesting you had good teachers, because you did say you started out in a school, a comprehensive school, which you should describe for the ignorant Americans among us, or North Americans, which was a grammar school. And one assumes that a grammar school is better than a comprehensive school. Is that a correct assumption?
No, it's not. I went to perfectly good Church of England primary and secondary schools, the local ones where I grew up in London, and I received an adequate education there. I think it was anything spectacular. It was fine. I then was transferred to a recently former grammar school. Grammar schools were the sort of jewel in the crown for families in Britain in the post-war period who couldn't afford to send their children to a private school.
Which is called a public school in England, isn't it?
Public.
Just to make it clear how confusing.
There's all sorts of, like liberal, all of this stuff just explodes as it crosses borders. But yes, a fee-paying school. If you couldn't afford a fee-paying school, then a grammar school was really your best hope. But the various governments abolished them, and then there are still some left, but they were thought to be too elitist and all sorts of other things. So I went to a school that had recently been a grammar school that was thought to be therefore to have some, kudos. It was an absolute zoo. And I mean, it was one of those times where, the teachers spend all of their time doing crowd control, and you have no time to learn.
Is this your words? It was described when I read it as a war zone similar to that many of the children's parents had escaped from. Must be your words, I assume.
I say that, golly. It could be my words. Gosh. Yes, it was certainly rough. I mean, the year after I left, a group of boys at school gang raped a female teacher in the classroom.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was pretty rough. So my parents realized I should get out of there pretty sharpish, and I did. And I managed to get a scholarship to a small fee-paying school in London, and from there to the most famous school in the country, Eton College. And from there to
and then Oxford
University. So I have that slightly shapeshifter thing, as you'll understand, Lawrence. I mean, it's because people inevitably wish to pigeonhole anyone, and that's quite understandable. On one hand, I have totally the most establishment of educations, and yet I always am pleased that I also saw it from the bottom up.
Well, I like that. My friend Stephen Fry's had the experience of being in prison and then also at Cambridge. So it's really
and it does that in his case. Obviously, it's given him a very interesting view on things. I mean, there are certain things which once you've seen them, you can't unsee, and
Yeah.
that's probably what it should be.
Yeah. I think that's right. Uh, um, it is interesting to me. I'm going to ask you. I actually lectured at Eton once, much to my surprise, and of course I was dressed much more poorly than the students, who were all in tails. And although they more looked like they all needed to be washed. All
Yes,
the
it's
tails.
hard to dress smarter than an Eton schoolboy.
Yeah. But it's an all boys school, and I have to ask this: the impression? And actually, Richards talked about this too, because it almost was a tradition. I mean, you're gay, and it and a gay experience seemed to, if you watch at all the movies, the British, boys' school movies, it seems like it's almost a British tradition to have that experience. And I know it's an appropriate thing to ask, but I'm wondering if just an aside, if it was during that period that you realized you were gay, or and if it had any impact.
No, I realized I was gay already, and I
Okay.
was rather hoping to go to Eton and to have a lot of being gay.
Okay.
And it wasn't the only reason I went, I just stressed.
Okay.
I
Well, that's
thought,
good.
well,
That's
it's bound to have be more.
Yeah.
If books are true, then surely. If
Yeah.
all the jokes are true, then surely. Actually, during my time there, it was an incredibly homophobic place.
Oh,
I was lucky enough to find some other students who were gay and who were at least able to talk, but with each other. But no, it was enormously homophobic, because of course that's one of the other ways it can happen.
yeah.
When a lot of boys together, is that of course they're very
Exactly. Pick on.
that age. They're very sensitive about their sexuality. They're very
They're very insecure, and the way to be insecure is to be homophobic. Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, when you're an adult and you're straight, there's like no need to be homophobic if you're not gay, because it's like, who cares? I'm living life.
Unless you're incredibly insecure again. I think it's people.
Unless you're very insecure, yeah.
Yeah.
But as a boy, I mean, and I remember a friend of mine saying to me then, "I wish there were girls at this school," and I remember saying, "But that mean there were fewer boys," and that,
Yeah.
and he said, "But they would have a civilizing influence." He
Yeah.
said,
I mean, I frankly, my daughter went to an all-girls school for a while, and which was very good when she was very young, but when she was an adolescent, anyway, she eventually moved, and I'm now think you absolutely need. I think it's a very good as a socializing experience. It's
yes,
single. There's arguments for single sex education, but I think as a part of school, the whole school experience, one of the reasons why I'm not particularly happy with homeschooling is that part of the school experience is not just education; it's socialization. It's learning how to live with others and experience others.
that's something, that's an insight that's particularly important after recent years of the pandemic. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember the first months of the pandemic, I phoned up a friend of mine who's now retired, a philosophy professor at Oxford, and we were speaking on the phone, and I said, "What do you think the long-term effect of this is going to be?" And he said, "Douglas, it's incalculable," because he said the great success, the great secret of education is that it's not the professors who educate the students educate each other.
Oh yeah, I've always said that. Yeah, absolutely.
And
It's your peers, and that's the only reason I've encouraged kids generally, to go to good universities. I mean, I've also said you can get a great education at any university. I mean, it's you
yeah, that's
determine
true.
your own education. But one of the reasons to go to a place where people actually like to learn is that peer-to-peer education,
Absolutely.
and that makes a huge difference. Yeah,
I found, by the way, I think I've said this before, I found intellectually speaking, Eton was much more stimulating for me than Oxford.
interesting.
And it was part of the quality of teachers there. I mean, almost every teacher there could have been an Oxford professor. Some of them had been.
Yeah,
But they also had that. I had some terrific tutors at Oxford as well, and some terrific lecturers. But broadly speaking, that desire to sort of impart the fire
of
to
course.
you was more prevalent at
Well,
Eton.
I mean, high school teachers are there to teach, and either they're love hating or it's just they've fallen into the job. And there's two categories, and one set are awful teachers, and one set are fantastic. But they are interested in teaching, and university professors, having been one for many years, are teach. But in if they're at a first rate university, they're interested in the researches, and teaching can be fun and enjoyable, but the dedication that a high school teacher has is, and if interesting experience. I also found in many ways high school a more interesting learning experience than as an undergraduate university. Now I switched from many fields and eventually did mathematics and physics, which which was quite different than the general education that I had. But the quality of the teaching much better in high school, and in areas I did, because it turns out I did history before I did physics. The history level of history I did at high school was much more rigorous than at university, I found.
Right.
Um,
Yes. Well, there's
but-
also that thing that one of the great curses of our age, which is the curse of hyperspecialization.
Yeah. In fact, that's right. And I remember trying to fight it. I did for a while. I started university as one of these degrees where you could do science and non-science at the same time. Eventually, I realized I had to choose, and I did mathematics and physics. But I because I liked history, I did that for a year, and then took a year off school to actually work on a history book. Which speaking of which, well, I worked on a history book during college. You wrote a book during college. But before we get to that, I want to get your bossy book. Is it, how do you pronounce it? Is it Bossy? Bosie. Lord Alfred Douglas. I want to ask you, did a degree in English. Why did you choose English? Was it because of the teachers you had in school?
Yes, I had thought of reading music and ended up changing to English. I actually, slightly worse than you described. I wrote my first book in my gap year between school and university.
That's great.
I finished it the week before I went to university, knowing pretty well that if I didn't finish it before going to university, it would be unfair.
That's why I had to take a year off from university.
Yeah.
It's the only way.
And you have to complete a project like that if you're doing it. And so I turned up to university with a finished book, which didn't get me love from all of my contemporaries.
Maybe some of your professors might have been happy about it, though.
Some of them were pretty annoyed. They were particularly annoyed because it came out in my second year. It was a bestseller, and that ruined my university career. Of course.
I can imagine. You would have been intolerable and insufferable, probably.
I mean, I'm totally insufferable to myself. I mean, everything had been done to ruin me. I was flown to New York for lunch, and that sort of thing. And,
I know.
I mean,
can
and
imagine.
I look back now and I think, I wish I'd have spent my time at Oxford doing what you're meant to do. But I spent my time wanting to get out. And
well, on the other hand, it's nice that you had a goal. But did you? Well, I was going to ask you why. I'll get to why you wrote the book. And by the way, we're going to eventually get to the subject here, but this is fascinating. Did you ever consider you wanted to start? Wanted to start music, but I'm just wondering, because you're obviously, as I am, political, at least in the sense of being interested in what's going on in the political world, even though we both have huge suspicions about politics governing human affairs. Do you think of political science? Did you? And the other word that has never entered into our conversation so much and so far, and one of the reasons I do this podcast is because I try and merge science and culture, and I think they're both, science is a part of our culture, and we need to understand that and appreciate it. But did you ever have any interest in science, or did you have any good science teachers?
Well, that's a very good. I've thought about that a lot in retrospect, because I read quite a lot of science books now. I have a lot of friends who are scientists, mathematicians, and so on. But firstly, I don't think I had very good science teachers. I had a physics teacher who was noticeably bad, would basically sit down and say to us, answer the questions on pages 10 to 15, don't disturb me, hand in your work, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that's a sort of excuse as well. The truth is, actually, Lawrence, I made a fundamental mistake in my teenage years, which I wish I hadn't have made now, which was that I thought that it was an either or. And I mean, it's not uncommon. I hope it's becoming less common. But that sort of CP Snow debate was still going on. And there was an expectation that if you were interested in the humanities, you were not interested in the sciences, and vice versa. It took some time for me to realize the error of that. I mean, I started to realize it when I was at the Junior Royal Academy of Music, and I realized that one of my favorite composers, Benjamin Britten, was also a great mathematician.
Yes.
Or a very good mathematician. And I remember thinking when I discovered that, that queers everything, in the old-fashioned sense. Yeah, I thought that really mucks up my theory. And then I discovered that, actually, as a lot of musicians, Bach, for instance, works in a sort of mathematical way.
Yeah, and a lot of mathematicians have certainly enjoyed music, and scientists.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
for some reason, I was pig-headed, I was stupid, too opinionated, and thought I'm a humanities person, and therefore the sciences are not for me.
yeah.
And
And people are told that too often. Still, I think. In fact, as
yeah,
a badge of honor. I don't know if
uh,
it's so much as when I was growing up. Certainly, was, and when I remember when I was writing my first science books, and I taught at Yale, which was, humanities were king, um, and it was amazing to me what a badge of honor was for people to say, well, I just can't get that science stuff, as if, well, that makes
yeah.
me cultured. Uh,
Well, that exactly. But I also learned that there's an attitude towards that which you can be encouraged to develop, and I was encouraged to develop it at Oxford, accidentally or deliberately, I don't know, by the various people, because inevitably in a college community, as you know, I mean, everyone sits at table at dinner, and you sit
mhm.
beside a physicist, and opposite a musician, and the other side's and it's the same at high table with the dons, with the
Yeah,
professors. And I realized at Oxford this incredibly important thing, which was that nobody was doing anything dull.
yeah, yeah. That's
And
nice.
I mean, I remember there was once a set of lectures for all of us who'd just come up as freshmen, you'd say, in America. And we were given a lecture by 4 or 5 lectures, each by somebody who was, in a particular department, and they're all wildly different. There was a lecture about Anglo-Saxon poetry
Mhm.
by the Anglo-Saxon professor. There was a lecture about the mating habits of the fruit fly by one of the biology professors. And I remember at the time, I still had that schoolboy thing in my
Uh-huh.
head of fnar,
Yeah,
what a ridiculous thing to spend your life studying. And he showed during the talk how fascinating this was.
yeah, yeah.
And then I suppose through that there's this line that actually often Stephen Fry likes to quote from Oscar Wilde, who describes somewhere the Oxford manner, which is to play gracefully with ideas. And actually that is something that an institution can impart. And one of the most important things of playing gracefully with ideas is sitting with somebody who's got a specialism you don't have, and finding stuff out, and
Yeah.
and saying to them, I'm not following you there, row back a bit for me.
It's the aha experience, which is orgasmic. I used to work
Yes,
in science museums when I was younger, and we used to call it the aha experience, and it is that where you suddenly see the world a new way, and it gives an intense kind of pleasure, and it's universal. It really does give an intense pleasure, I think, to everyone, no matter how turned off their mind is.
by
Um,
the way, wouldn't you agree that one of the most stimulating things, and certainly this is something I found as an adult, almost invariably, the things that spark me off now to new ideas or new ways of seeing things almost invariably come from disciplines I do not have.
oh yeah,
Uh, it's when I'm at a conference or a seminar with somebody who tells me something in a discipline I do not understand, which I get like one nugget of, and I go,
yeah,
"That's what I'm trying to put my finger on in my own language."
yeah, yeah. No,
And
it's
those are the things that make you have those sort of mind orgasms.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, and I think that's yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the frankly, there are two things about this. One of the reasons I like to write books is because it forces me often to have the discipline to enter into a territory I might not feel comfortable with, and requires me to interact with people and learn things that I wouldn't otherwise, and that's a lot of fun. But it's one of the reasons I with what I'm doing now in this particular podcast is to jumping across from having scientists to journalists to writers to movie directors, because that diversity of human intellectual inquiry is so fascinating, and it is all one thing, which I would can call culture, and it is, and turning off any part of it is a tragedy. But moreover, being turned on to new things is a joy, and I hope in some ways some of these things impart that experience, and I'm sure my conversation with you will do that to some people as well, I think. But it also relates to something we are going to get to eventually, which is John Stuart Mill's notion of free speech. The notion of learning that something you thought was true is wrong is a great joy, but it's an opportunity, and it's the opportunity that free speech provides. But we'll get there. But it's interesting that your music experience. So did you decide you weren't good enough musician to continue in that experience, or was it just because your interests were elsewhere?
Well, what I actually was, I was a composer primarily,
Oh,
and
okay.
I what I discovered in writing my first book was that whatever it was I was trying to communicate was better communicated in words for
Then,
me.
yeah,
That's not the
okay.
same with everyone, of course. Not
Yeah,
every. I know lots of composers who obviously don't have that instinct at
sure.
all.
Yeah,
But that was at some point I became aware that that was the language I wanted to communicate in. I was always actually Christopher used to say that he was rather surprised when he discovered I was a musician, and he said I remember him saying to me once, "There's always one of the arts you can't do,"
yeah, yeah. And
and he
music
said
is.
the one he couldn't was music.
Yeah, I love
But
music, but
yeah,
I'm incapable. And my daughter was a very good musician, and I thus got to be involved with a lot of the music community as a result. And it was I loved it. In fact, I actually got to perform with the Cleveland Orchestra, even that which we lived there. And and um speaking of music and science and thinking of the two cultures, here's a story, an interesting story, because there's a physicist I used to know named John Glaser. He won the Nobel Prize for inventing something called the bubble chamber, and he was from Cleveland, which is where at that when I escaped from New Haven, I became chair of University in Cleveland, and he told me he played with at that time the Cleveland Philharmonic, which was an orchestra below the Cleveland Orchestra, which is a famous orchestra. And he was a good violinist, and he was trying to decide what to go into his college, his father, and he was okay in science, he was okay in science, and his father told him go into science. He said because as a mediocre musician, you'll never get a job, but as a mediocre scientist, you'll be fine.
and there's a secondary part of that advice that I've heard people give, which is if the thing you love is something you think you might end up hating if you go into it, don't go into it.
Yeah, that's I think,
Don't ruin the love.
and you
And
tend to continue to only love the things you're good at, ultimately, I think, and
that's true. I mean, I still play the piano
yeah,
for my own personal enjoyment and do every day. But no. But on the thing I mentioned about the arts you can't do, the art I really envied was painting,
oh,
which I can't do at all.
hmm
But the painter Francis Bacon, as opposed to the essayist,
yeah,
made a great impact on me when I was a young man, and I was always deeply envious of his ability to communicate everything onto the canvas. Now, that isn't something a musician can do. For instance, you
yeah,
cannot communicate anger. I mean, there are ways in which you can do it. So the scherzo of Shostakovich 10 is a pretty good example
hmm
of a composer communicating anger at the start, almost certainly
yeah,
start. But the point is that generally speaking, there's all sorts of specific registers that music is simply not able to do.
hmm
Uh, that having been said, it can also do a register that nothing else
no,
can
no,
do.
exactly. It's and which is
Schopenhauer says everything aspires to the form of music, and whatever was it? It was Wittgenstein, wasn't it, at the end of his life, said about one of his great philosophical works. I wish I'd said it in verse.
in verse. Yeah,
I've always said that I think no writer hasn't at some points thought, I wish I could say that in music. But nevertheless, for some reason in my late teens, words started to take over, and the interest in words and communicating
yeah,
with
yeah.
words became the thing I realized was actually what I was meant to be doing.
Okay, I was good. As a side, I was going to ask. I mean, there was a lot of controversy when Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature. I had no problem with it myself because his words uh, had a big impact on me growing up. His less so than well, and the music did too. Um, uh, and I'm wondering whether what yeah, I mean, his
The
politics
Nobel
are very different
Prize,
than yours.
the Nobel Prize in Literature has been given to so many ropey candidates by now.
Yeah.
Not least, I could not. I fell out of any sympathy with it when they gave it to Harold Pinter.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Okay.
Not least for
Anyway.
his poetry, which was beyond awful, particularly
Yeah,
by
no,
the
it
end.
is it's perhaps only it's second only to the Peace Prize for being
Yes.
inappropriate. I think, among those prizes, and prizes are largely arbitrary anyway. I was going to ask you why you wrote the book that when you did, but it's just been fascinating. But I do want to move on. But it is fascinating to me that you wrote the book when you did, and maybe you just wanted to have that experience. Um, but you quit in university. Other than doing that and writing a play and doing a few other things, you emerged as what you called a neoconservative. And did that arise? Was that again inbred, or was that did that arise out of your university experience, or what?
No, it was several things. One was that I had entirely, with the exception of very closely following the war in the Balkans, I had almost no interest in politics as an undergraduate. I had no interest ever in party politics. I had no interest in joining the Labour Club or the Conservative
Mm.
Club. All of these things filled me with horror, mainly because of the people
Yeah,
involved.
sure. I could.
And
Mhm.
one of my embarrassments going back just occasionally to speak at places like the Oxford and Cambridge Union is that I'm always asked by the various,
Yeah,
people in
been
their
there,
posts.
done
So
it.
what did you do when you were here? Which post did you have? And I would have to say I didn't do anything here really. But you must remember I came once to something. But and the thing I can never say is because of people like you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I never had much appetite for that
Mhm.
incredibly voracious, hungry politico type.
Mhm.
But I was interested in the ideas, and I was unusual by my last year at a university of actually reading the paper every day.
Oh.
That was almost unheard of. I remember the chaplain at my college said, "Usually, Douglas, when somebody's carrying a paper, it means it's the end of term." Um, a newspaper signals that you want to find out what's happening in the rest of the world
Yeah,
before you go back into it.
yeah.
I was very interested in that. I suppose the neocon thing was, which is a word that I now regard as being almost unusable. It means so many things and so many bad things to most
Mhm.
people. It's just one of those words you sort of have to give
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
But, but there was to cut a long story short, there were two things really. One was the aftermath of 9/11, where I thought, like a lot of us did at the time, rather bullishly, doubtless, and filled with certainty, but nevertheless, it felt that something had happened that needed serious addressing, and that an outrage had been perpetrated at the heart of American democracy, which deserved more than the sort of platitudes of, we've brought this on ourselves and the stuff that I thought at that point, it was something that Jean Kirkpatrick said at the time of the Vietnam protests. She said, nobody doubts that we can improve, but in order to improve, we have to continue and survive.
Hmm.
And that was very much my view at that time. I didn't like the sort of many. That was the first sort of shedding of friends, I think.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
was the friends who was in the sort of, well, so what, America brought it upon herself, who are we to say, and so on. And the second thing was my discovery of a group of very remarkable thinkers from America mainly, who I started reading and really it was very sort of just sympathetic with, specifically Irving Kristol,
Hmm. Interesting.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, other figures like this,
There's
who
one of
were
those I'm sympathetic to, but anyway.
but people who, apart from anything else, have made a very interesting intellectual journey. I mean, I think that right and left, we might get into this, mean less and less, and maybe always
Yeah,
have been tricky things to define. I don't much like the dichotomy. It's sort of like a
yeah,
lot of these dichotomies. It's useful to an extent and also tedious.
yeah.
Uh, but these were people who made the intellectual journey from the left in the post-war era to the right during the Cold War era. And I
Mm.
found, for various reasons, I just found these people attitudinally, behaviorally, intellectually very sympathetic. I liked their style. I liked their outlook on things. They were sort of liberal in a true sense,
Classical.
but not being so liberal that their minds fell out,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and I saw a lot of people whose minds were falling out, and so I sort of inevitably migrated towards the people who I thought hadn't had that experience. In retrospect, now, I mean, one of my best friends said, because my book on neoconservatism is my one book I won't allow to be republished,
Oh,
because
interesting.
most of it is an intellectual history of neoconservatism, but the last chapter is not. And I would have to write the last chapter completely from scratch, or just reissue it, say these are my mea culpas, these are my. But I wrote that in 2004, I suppose, and it's a young man's book, which, funnily enough, my first book was not.
Isn't that interesting? Well, look, I was going to ask you to define neoconservative. Anytime one says neo, like there's new atheists, and I'm always suspicious, let me put it that way, of neo, because I think most ideas have been around for a long time, and they're not really new, and so I'm always suspicious of the word when it's attached to a word. But I don't want to even go into neo, because there's so much more we can talk about, which we will get to, and some of those views might be called neoconservative. You did work for The Spectator, or maybe you still did, which is a conservative newspaper.
Still doing. So the associate editor, which is a title nobody understands.
Yeah. Okay, well, I don't want to go there then. We may get there. I'm not. No. The least interesting thing to talk about is editors in the world. So anyway,
no, I started writing for Spectator when I was at Oxford. I started reviewing books for them, and then I started writing political pieces shortly after I was out of university.
I may have actually written something for them once. Anyway, because even though it's funny how I've now bridged the transition from a leftist to what some people might call the right, only because I'm interested in truth and reality. But and we'll get there. But it is. I thought it was poetic, if you'll forgive the pun, that your interest in poetry appeared, and when you were as an editor of The Spectator, you were involved in the Poetry Prize, weren't you? Which was won by Boris Johnson. Is that not right?
Yes, you touch on a piece of history which I'm actually very proud of. That's right. Yeah, how long ago was that? 6, 7, 8 years ago? No, it was 2016. I remember it was a year of the referendum on Brexit. Boris Johnson was the foreign secretary. Yes. So to cut a long story short, it was a moment of brilliant inspiration, if I do say so on my part. There was a German comedian who'd made a joke about Erdogan, president of Turkey, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan had been insulted by this late night German comic, who had implied that, among other things, in a funny poem on air, and applied among other things, that Erdogan's relationship with the animal kingdom was not entirely platonic. Now, that's where I come from, as I'm sure where you come from. That's standard insult fare by satire.
Yeah.
Erdogan did not see the funny side. Asked when he got word of it in Ankara, called for the then Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, to prosecute the comedian. And there is a lèse-majesté law on the books in Germany about insulting foreign rulers. I was absolutely incensed by this, and the idea that in 2016 a European comedian could be censored by the state, let alone, as at the time seemed possible, even imprisoned. A Dutch comedian friend of mine put out a very funny video. We sort of said, why don't we do an I am Spartacus thing? And my Dutch friend put out a video saying that he'd given Erdogan a blowjob and he hadn't paid him for it, and he owed him the money, and he wasn't going to forgive him until he gave him the cash, and I decided to do it through the medium of poetry. So I announced that I would give £1,000 cash prize to the person who could write the most defamatory poem about Erdogan. And I suggested we do it in the limerick form, which is, of course, only 5 lines. And that adds up to £200 a line, which by my calculation was the highest paid poetry prize in the world at the time.
Interesting. Okay.
And I gave an example of what I thought should be the sort of style we were going for, and wrote an incredibly lavatorial and bestial limerick, and said, this is the sort of thing we're after. And entries poured in from all over the world, including Turkey. It actually became a bit too much for me, because there were so many thousands of entries coming in.
Read them all.
Anyhow, the point was that then in the end, a mutual friend, whilst interviewing Boris, said, have you seen what Douglas is doing with this poetry competition? Boris said yes, and they made up a limerick on the spot, which wasn't very good. But the friend called me immediately, said, Boris Johnson's just done a limerick. I think we should enter it and make it win.
Oh, it was fixed. Oh,
exactly.
darn.
So it was sort of fixed because I thought actually that will cause maximum diplomatic damage to
Sure.
Erdogan.
Yeah.
And indeed, that'll give most coverage to the comedian, most importantly, which is that it would therefore become clear that you could not prosecute a comedian in Germany for doing something that the foreign secretary in Britain had done.
So it was well intentioned.
It did cause a diplomatic incident. I still can't go to Turkey, sadly, but you know, life is partly cutting off doors.
Yeah, well, there's enough place. Yeah,
going up bridges.
Well, it was a noble cause. I mean, it wasn't just.
I do feel very strongly about that sort of thing. I feel very strongly about that.
The satire is usually the best way to respond to. Well, often the best way to respond to ridiculous strictures on speech. And
people don't know what to do with it. I mean, there was actually a man in Ankara shortly after my competition who was arrested by the police for asking the way to the zoo. By that point, the police in Turkey couldn't work out what was satire and what was simply traffic direction. So
there you go. Okay. Well,
satire
I'm very pleased that I just produced a piece where I was able to reproduce the 7 swear words that George Carlin talked about could never be talked about on TV. I just for Quillette, and it came out, and I think it's gonna come out in Canadian paper too, and I want to see what they do with those words.
It's very interesting.
In any case, we'll see. But this kind of provoking is I know that's not the reason you write books, but part of the reason to get people to think about things is provoke. And I have to say, your book, the last 2 books, have been provocative in a sense. And one of the things I really enjoyed about them, besides the fact that they're brilliant, is brilliantly written. And I agree with most of the stuff in them too, which doesn't hurt. I want to go to the madness of crowds, which is, I was surprised. I read it. I completely reread it again the last 2 days, and for which I was cursing you in the middle of the night at one point the other day, but not only because I really wanted to get through it again. You don't mention. I'm assuming the title is related to Charles Mackay's 1841 book. I didn't see any mention to that in the book, but he wrote. It's a.
I think I mentioned in introduction. I think I mentioned.
Really, I didn't see it, so maybe I missed it, but I'm sure it must be there because I didn't see it in the introduction. But it was a great book called "Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds," 1841. And I loved it. I think, I don't know if he said this or someone else said this. It was a distillation of some of the most humiliating, terrifying, and confusing things humans have done in collectivity, which I think is a wonderful thing because, and what he made fun of was alchemy and the crusades and haunted houses. And so you then decided to write a book where you'd make fun of things like gender, race, identity, and trends. And I thought, well, those are all the things you're told sort of never to talk about at a Thanksgiving dinner or a dinner with friends, right? All the things that are going to produce nothing but vitriol. And I thought, what a great subject to move, that segue from the madness of crowds, from alchemy, etc., to the things that really are viewed with craziness.
Yes. The interesting thing is, Lawrence, is the only people, I do hope I credit Charles Mackay, I think I do somewhere, but yes, his book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, is today I discover only really well known by people in hedge funds and certain bits of financial markets. I've spoken at places where people have said, I give this out to all of my employees when they join. And I had a wonderful economist friend who died a couple of years ago from COVID, actually, called Deepak Lal. And I remember he once said to me years ago that he had gone to a library of a new university somewhere. He used to teach economics at UCLA and LSE, among others, but he had been taken around a new library somewhere, I think in the Indian subcontinent. But anyhow, and he asked to see their economic history department, and they didn't have one. And they said, well, they regarded economic history like medical history. as it were, as something which we'd gone beyond.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
So the important thing about giving the man with extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds to people who work in markets is this is the bit that it could be forgotten knowledge and will be the knowledge you need the most.
Yes, absolutely.
And funnily enough, all of the modern editions of Charles Mackay's book only include the bits on bubbles, on financial bubbles, bubble, the Mississippi bubble, and so on. And that's a shame because the original includes, as you mentioned, these social ones as well.
Yeah, I must have an old version then. Yeah, somewhere.
No, I mean, there's much more in this. I mean, I have a book somewhere above me here, I think, called "We Believe the Children" that a friend lent me recently about the child satanic sex abuse scare in America in the 1980s, where people went to prison for were given sentences of hundreds of years. I mean, some of the longest sentences ever for moral panic, which ended up to be based on nothing. And
I'm very happy to have had a podcast with the psychologist, the woman who showed this was nonsense. And
yes, it's so both of these things, the memory that there are financial stampedes and madnesses, but also social sort of contagion madnesses, is very important to know about. And we always look back on them with such sort of disdain. Who could possibly think that? But, these things have happened in our own time as well.
Yeah, maybe. And it's sort of, in some sense, I suppose it can comfort us when we do look at the present madness of crowds, which you and I are going to look at and talk about, that that at least this, maybe one can sometimes think this too shall pass. But even if it doesn't seem like it will. And in fact, speaking of poetry, I guess the reason to think about these things is one of my favorite lines from Mark Twain about history. You probably know what he said. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot.
Absolutely. One of the truest things ever said. Yes.
Yeah. And by the way, I can't help but think there's a book that I first learned about that book, about the Mackay book, because a friend of mine, a very well-known physicist, actually referred me to a more modern version of it, written by someone I love called Martin Gardner. And I don't know if you've ever read it, called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. And if you haven't, I'm going to buy it and send it to you.
Let me make a note of it myself. Yeah.
It is a modern version of that, which is which is really, and it does talk about things, including financial issues, but it's a wonderful book. You should look at it.
I mean, I'd love to, but I mean, look at what's going on at the moment. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
Collapsing, and
you could rewrite that book. But he used to write for Scientific American and give these wonderful mathematical puzzles, but he was a remarkable guy. Anyway, and then so I like to sort of, if you wish, I like to think of the progression of there's a Mackay book and then his book and now your book, which we're going to talk about, and which is a madness that we both agree is going on. In fact, to be in the interest of full disclosure, you and I probably first met personally in Portland when I lived there, having dinner with our mutual friend Peter Bogosian, and talking about the very issues that we both share and our concerns about, which are the issues that have, to my amusement, I see myself called a conservative pundit at times, which is hysterical since I'm far to the left of most people in many other ways. But it is this craziness, and at the very beginning of the book, you say, and what I plan to do is I'm going to focus on a number of quotes you've gone through, and we're going to go through there and try and get to a little bit to the war in the West, and then return to poetry if we have time, and we'll see how it goes. If it's too long, and if you're enjoying this, we can always stop and then carry it on another day, because I'm enjoying it. It's up to you. But you say we're going through a great crowd derangement in public and in private, both online and off. People are behaving in ways that are increasingly irrational, feverish, herd-like, and simply unpleasant. The daily news cycle is filled with the consequences, yet while we see the symptoms everywhere, we do not see the causes. And you say the simple fact that we have been living through a period of more than a quarter of a century in which all our grand narratives have collapsed. This is your rationale for why it's happened. One by one, the narratives we have had were refuted, become unpopular to defend, or impossible to sustain. The explanation for our existence that used to be provided by religion went first, falling away from the 19th century onwards. Then, over the last century, the secular hopes held out by all political ideologies began to follow in religion's wake. In the latter part of the 20th century, we entered the postmodern era, an era which defined itself and was defined by its suspicion towards all grand narratives. However, as all school children learn, nature abhors a vacuum, and into the postmodern vacuum, new ideas began to creep with the intention of providing explanations and meanings of their own. And that one question I wanted to ask, which is, one could infer from that, and I don't think you mean that some people have said that part of this, what you and I both agree is a secular religion nowadays, comes from the fall of religion itself. I don't think that's the case myself, and I wanted to ask if you think the fact that, if you think religiosity would have saved us from that or not.
Well, I think it is religiosity. I just think it's a new sort of cult version of it.
It is a new cult version. I agree with you. We both agree there.
It's a little, because I mean, to refine the point about the religiosity of it, I think that I think it is more cult-like than religion, actually, because a cult is something that says, and if your family don't agree, cut them off.
Exactly. Well, some religions say that too. Sometimes
some religions say it too as well, and certainly have done in the past.
Yeah.
But I mean, in the present, I think it would be an unusual vicar who would tread into the pulpit and say...
It would be an unusual vicar. It might not be an unusual Ayatollah, for example.
Oh, a very commonplace Ayatollah, almost dime a dozen.
And that's just, but as I keep pointing out, the only difference is one of history. A vicar 500 years ago would have been exactly the same as Ayatollah today, in the sense of England would have burned someone at the stake easily for the wrong views.
That's certainly true. Everyone's been through their own pasts. I mean, but I do think that I mean, one of the things I tried to get to, just as you cut through bracken, in my experience, at the beginning of a book, you sort of cut through bracken to get to the place you want to start from.
Yeah.
And I put that in about that because I do think that the absence of religion leaves a hole, and the hole is a God-shaped hole, and in particular, there is this desire to be good and do good, and of course, as everyone knows, to really do evil, you've got to think you're doing good, and the vehemence and the dogmatism in our day. I mean, there's this very interesting, whenever you see videos online of a sort of the new religion sort of protesting, one's always struck by their means of communication. It is, for instance, shouting something repeatedly.
Yeah.
That's a quasi-religious way of like drumming something into you until you give in.
And not wanting, and repeating it so that you can't say anything, because the last thing people want to hear is something they don't want to hear.
It's literally the opposite of communication.
Yeah, exactly.
It's dictation, dogmatism, repeated so much. I mean, I'm surprised they still employ the tactic, because for many of us, like myself, nothing would make me less likely to join an argument that person shouting the same thing over and over again. So yes, I do think that it's got lots of the hallmarks of religion. As I've pointed out before, it has also got the disadvantages of not having certain things that certain religions do.
Redemption. Redemption
is the most important. The Judeo-Christian religion has this particularly important issue of redemption. And I quote Hannah Arendt, who's not a thinker I'm especially fond of, but she, in an essay in the 50s, wrote something which I cite in The Madness of Crowds about this fact that it is the nature of our action in the universe that we as human beings do not know the consequences of our actions, of our words even. And as you know, I mean, all writers fear this to some extent. You can't fear it too much, or you would never start typing in the morning. But you don't know who's going to read your words and misinterpret them.
You can be certain that they'll be misinterpreted.
There'll be somebody who will, and then you've got to work out, well, are they malicious misinterpretations or misinterpretations because I've written badly? I mean,
that's the concern, is that you don't want to knowingly mislead.
Exactly, and that's why you have, that's why as a writer, obviously we all have to hone our craft and be as precise in our language and our meaning as possible. But yes, I suppose that my concern in recent years has been that there has been this leaping in of bad faith arguments, of deliberate wanton misinterpretation, assertion of things that we don't know, and an unwillingness to be humble before things. And the obvious example I give, and sorry, and just to finish the point on Arendt says, because we don't know how our actions will reverberate in the universe, the only mechanism we've ever come up with to answer that is forgiveness. It's the mechanism of forgiveness. And that is something, as I mentioned, the Madness of Crowds, that our own era spends almost zero time thinking about.
In fact, the opposite. We
quite the opposite.
Specifically, as you point out at length, the modern world, especially social media, makes certain that people's words that may be misinterpreted are never buried.
Yes, well, it used to be the old thing in public relations. The wisdom used to be apologize and move on.
Yeah.
Now you apologize and you're killed.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeremy Clarkson, who writes the newspaper I write for, wrote a say over the top, deliberately sort of meant to be funny column about Meghan Markle and Meghan and Harry Sussex, as what you call them. And he ended up being forced to apologize 5 times. And then the Sussexes didn't accept his apology and insulted him again. And you just sort of think, well, in that case, we're in some very strange world. Anyhow, my own view is that we should understand and be forgiving if we can be, because we'll need forgiveness ourselves. And I say that on certain things, I mean, I finished the Madness of Crowds on the trans issue, which now lots of people are writing about. I'm happy to see. But at the time, very few people were. And my simple assertion was, we're pretending to know things we just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the arc I'm eventually heading towards, is because that's one of the reasons why I think it's why I resonate so much with it. Because, and I don't mean this to sound self-serving, but it will, because I wrote a book that now my new book that's coming out is called The Known Unknowns, and the whole point of it is to acknowledge that to me the greatest thing that science offers us is the fact to realize that we don't know, and to know what we don't know is incredibly important, because it's an invitation to learn, but it's also a humility. It's a recognition that there are things we don't understand, and we need that more than anything as a civilizing influence as well as a learning influence.
I can't wait to read that. But can I ask your view on something then? Because one of the things that strikes me about this thing of we don't know is, as you say, it requires a certain humility. But here's something else. It also strikes me that it requires a certain amount of something like confidence.
Yeah, sure.
In that, I mean, I have a friend, for instance, who works with gang members or reformed gang members, and she always says, the main problem is it's all about respect, and having to be respected. And you realize these are people with no self-respect, and that's why they're so intent to even sort of stab somebody if they show them any disrespect, perceived or otherwise. It seems to me that when it comes to admitting to things you don't know, you can't do it if you have that massive self-doubt.
Oh, and you can't do, I mean, that's why I think one of the reasons why some teachers, frankly, are hesitant to say it, because they teach from a syllabus, because they're very worried about being presented with things they don't know, and they have that insecurity. And it really takes great confidence to be willing to recognize that you don't know things. But that's one of the lessons, I think, when I view one of the reasons to learn science. And I've always, it's like learning any human intellectual activity is not just the content. The content, it may be fascinating. I happen to think it's among the most fascinating stuff that humans have ever come up with, obviously. But more equally important, it's that it teaches you things, a way to approach the world that is useful in other ways, and that and it and the scientific method, the constant need for skepticism is one thing, but the constant willingness to be wrong, I think, is a really one of the greatest gifts that science can give us. And
Yes. But you can probably only do it if you felt in the past that you've done things which are right, you know.
Yeah. And in fact, it's really important when you say I don't know. People misinterpret that when we say when we talk about things, and people often use it as a hammer against science, because they say, well, you don't know this. And it's true, we don't know a lot of things, but people misinterpret. Not knowing something doesn't mean we don't know anything. And
Yes.
and I often say it's not evidence for God, it's evidence of lack of knowledge, or it's not evidence for so acknowledging that you don't know something is not the same as saying you know nothing. And I think that's another confusion that I think.
Well, I mean, imagine if on something like, I mean, the reason why I did gay first in the Manners of Crowds was to sort of try to ease the reader into saying, look, I'm willing to on the one identity crampon that I can claim to have. So, trust me that I'm willing, I'm doing the others on as well. But I do say sometimes to friends, if you want, skip the gay chapter, I mean, you don't have to, but like, if you get bored reading about that. But I don't think it is boring. But anyway, the point is,
no. I think it's interesting because it is. Well, anyway, we're going to talk.
The point is the really interesting one. Because gay and trans that I write about in that book affect such a small percentage of the population.
Well, trans, it used to be that trans was a much smaller percentage than gay, and we're seeing that change for social.
Yeah, if the current trajectories continue, everybody in America is going to identify as trans by the year 2050.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, or at least queer. That's the one, because that's the only way in which a straight white male can now be on the victim hierarchy. Unless you do a 23andMe test and really luck out, obviously. But no, the one that interests me in that was I thought, firstly, the relations between the sexes, between men and women, because I always say, even if I don't have any dog in this fight myself, I do want the species to continue.
That's awfully generous. Anyway.
And would like my benighted, beleaguered heterosexual friends to be able to have some happiness in this life. Anyway, and the other thing is that I also mentioned with regards to race, because that's something that now affects absolutely everybody. I think these issues, I mean, all I tried to do in the Manners of Crowds really is to open them up and say, these are the really interesting things that we should be thinking and talking about.
And we should be talking about, but we're either afraid to talk about or we're afraid to listen about. Some things get talked about ad nauseum, but not listened to. And some, as we'll talk about, art you can't even ask questions about, which for me is we'll get to that near the end, and mostly with trans stuff now, which is really the thing that offends me the most, because as a scientist, nothing is sacred, and not everything should be questioned. And that, as an academic, that's the thing that depresses me most about the modern world, including the academic world, is that increasingly institutionally, people are accepting the notion that some things can't be questioned, and once you do that, education goes out the window.
By the way, that's why, and I think I mentioned this somewhere in the Manners of Crowds, but this is why when I was starting to notice the subjects for that book and sort of thinking it over, one of the big signifiers to me was friends of mine who were scientists who were saying to me, I can't do this. Like, I can't agree to this. I mean, people had sometimes had no interest in social policy, no interest. They just wanted to do their thing.
Yeah, which is what
they found that they were being told to lie. And they were just like, I can't do this. The people in humanities have been lying for years.
People in humanities have been lying for years, and I figured it would never happen in science. And I wish there were more people who'd say, I can't do this. But what we're finding is that, I mean, I've said this before in podcasts, and I was a professor for 40 years, and academics are largely cowards. and because it's a very safe profession. It's sort of, you're safe, and the main thing you want to do is keep your head under the radar and just go on and do your own thing, and that's most academics want to do. Okay, just don't bother me. I just want to do what I'm doing, and therefore, even though they don't believe a lot of the nonsense, they don't have the, unfortunately, I mean, and I would say it's intellectual courage to be able to be willing to speak up against it, which is fine if it's a minority, if it's just a little bit of nonsense. When I taught at Yale, we used to just laugh at the deconstructionists down the hill when I taught in the 80s there, because it was just nonsense. And this will never affect us, so why worry about it? But eventually, just like, they're going to come for the lawyers, and then they're going to come for,
the sluices weren't as strong as we thought they were.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we've talked around this, I should say, the things you talk about that are madness are largely this, right away, the social justice, identity group politics, intersectionalism, as they relate to the topics we talked about, which are gay, women, race, and trans, in that order, going, I think, from the least incendiary to the most incendiary topics, which I think is a good way to do that. And right off, you do, and I have to say, I first learned this from Christopher Hitchens, because, but then I recognized with John Stuart Mill this notion about why free speech, which is being attacked in almost all the contexts of those four areas, is being attacked. I'm going to read you. I'm going to read what you write here. On Liberty, first published in 1859, John Stuart Mill famously laid out four reasons for why free speech was a necessity in a free society. The first and second being that a contrary opinion may be true or true in part, and therefore may require to be heard in order to correct your own erroneous views, which is what Christopher first sort of made clear to me when in a discussion. The third and fourth being that even if the contrary opinion is an error, the airing of it may help to remind people of a truth and prevent its slippage into an ignorant dogma, which may in time, if unchallenged, itself become lost. And you talk about the modern world, and you say things have moved so swiftly that it's also been seen to be the replacement of one dogma with another, a move from a position of moral opprobrium to a position of expressing opprobrium to anyone whose views fall even narrowly outside the remit of a newly adopted position. The problem with this is not just that we are at risk of being unable to hear positions that are wrong, but we may also be preventing ourselves from listening to arguments that may be partially true. And that's, I think, what's so characteristic of the four topics you talk about, and why you and I share this. Well, obviously, this emotional and intellectual abhorrence to it, enough for you to write books about it and me to sometimes write articles about it. And your first example is gay, and in talking about the shift from the remarkably wonderful shift that 10 years ago you and I would both have celebrated on its own, which is the amazing speed with which from instead of being ostracized to being accepted universally, being gay. For me, I have, being heterosexual, I did have that learning experience of having a child, and for me it was kind of obvious early on that it was not going to be an issue, because I saw things like gay marriage being disputed by older men, largely in Supreme Courts and laws. But when I saw my daughter, I saw that for kids her age, it was not an issue at all. I mean, it's just not. And, like Max Planck said about science, science proceeds one funeral at a time. I realized that, it's eventually these older people are going to be dead, and these young kids have a sociology where it's not an issue. And so it won't be surprising to me if there's this sudden shift because of a generational shift. I don't know if it surprised you any more than that.
No, only that, I mean, it was shown that attitudes towards homosexuality changed in countries like America in exactly the same way that attitudes towards things like interracial marriage changed. They changed depending on just the extent to which people knew somebody in in this situation. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. If you just, it's just a matter of
like the
knowing
more people
someone.
came out, the more as being gay, the more people realized that well, you're not talking about them, you're talking about my friend or my son or my nephew or whatever. And that's the same way all of the social, genuine social progress really has occurred in our time. I mean, why are there so few people in America today, for instance, who are against interracial marriage? It's because there's very few people who are in such a silo that.
Yeah, it's the people who are in silos who remain that way, right? Once
So,
you know it, and if you talk about it later on, I think I forget whether it's in this book or the War in the West. Maybe it's the end of this book. Oh yeah, you talk about the historian. What's his name? The American historian, ancient historian. He said one of the great things about American democracy was face-to-face
oh yeah,
interaction.
Tocqueville. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
Tocqueville is one of his most interesting observations. Yeah, so that's how whole way in which Americans seem to decide things. And in fact, an example, which of course comes after the Tocqueville's time, but one of the ones that's always on my mind is the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
yeah.
They went round the country doing that, and Lincoln was really precise about going over the transcripts of those debates and correcting any errors, not making it better, but any just reporting errors.
Yeah.
Making sure that it was the most accurate possible version of the debates that were being read in state after state across the union, and that's how things used to be done in America.
And that face-to-face is it falls over in this way. It's meeting people. It's actually getting to know the person rather than your imagination about the person or even what they say. It's the humanity that
Yes.
that changes your views towards people ultimately. And yeah, and it's always been for me. I love being wrong. It's one of, just as I told you, I get to be that way a lot. But one of the great joys is finding that someone you thought you'd, I guess, dislike is one way of thinking about it. You don't. I mean, I have to say, one of the people we both know, Jordan Peterson, is a person who I had many, I still have questions about a number of his views, and some of the things he writes, I think are nonsense. But when we talked, when we first did our first podcast, or even talked before that, and he was genuinely interested in learning, and then I thought suddenly I had, and vice versa, I wanted to learn. Then I totally changed my view. I thought, okay, here's someone I can have a discussion with who's actually interested in asking questions, and it changed.
Yes.
It was.
I adore Jordan. He's a wonderful man, a wonderful thinker, enormous force for good. But there have been figures even in my own life who I have had disagreements with, often profound disagreements. But if you do it face to face, you almost always learn something.
Of course, yeah.
Like I've always been very, very keen with television to always be in the studio if you can.
If you can, yeah.
Always learn something from a host or from a fellow guest. You always, if you've got your eyes open for it, you always learn something. You think, he can't do that. He's not very good at that. Or wow, my gosh, she picked that up fast.
Yeah. If you listen, if you want to listen,
you can be in a commercial break, and the interviewer says, so, and they ask a very basic question, I think, and then they come back and they do it as if they've known it all their lives.
Yeah.
And you can have a bit of you that thinks, oh, hang on, do you do that with everything? But then the other bit is, that's really impressive
that you can do that. Yeah.
technically.
Oh, you see, you're lucky you do it. Unfortunately, because I do. We've talked about this before, the fact that when you write, you're misinterpreted. And my feeling has always been good. It's okay when I write about, because being misinterpreted about the beginning of the universe is never going to hurt anybody. So I'm safe. But similarly, my experience with having been on TV is quite the opposite, because they're terrified of science. And so I always have to walk them through it. It's because instead of appearing confident, they almost always, their lack of confidence shows through. And it's a matter of, during the commercial breaks, it's a matter of saying, it's okay. This will be okay. We'll get through this. Don't worry.
Yeah. Well, that is, I mean, one of the things I've railed against a certain amount in the past few years has been the expectation that anyone in the public eye must perforce be an expert in everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a shame.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. Well, this is totally aside, but what the heck? It's fascinating to me what you have to say about this. So, that's one of the problems as a writer of science that I have is people are willing to. I first noticed it in scientific book reviews. A great book review of a science book is "It boggled my mind." That's make it a bestseller. If you took the example I used to give was, say, John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist, but if you read a book review in, say, an American magazine like the New Yorker, you could pick a British one, you'd never read a book review of that saying it boggled my mind. Even if the person really didn't get what the person said, they'd be willing to go on for 10 pages about it.
Yeah.
But the problem with science is you can appear foolish much more quickly, I think. And people realize that, and it makes them often afraid, especially TV people, afraid. It's okay to not know the answer, to misinterpret, to be contradicted on politics. But somehow there's a fear.
Are you sure that isn't just simply the scientific illiteracy in the general population?
I think it is scientific literacy, but it's also a prop. I guess this is going to sound patronizing, and it is, but it's because scientific illiteracy is easier to spot sometimes than literacy in other areas, because it's easier to see when you're wrong or when you're spouting nonsense, because they're manifest empirical evidence. Now, it would be great if that were true in areas like trans and everything else, but in the hard sciences, at least the kind of science I do, it's easier to spot when someone is just completely spouting nonsense, and whereas you can spout nonsense in theology or
politics.
Politics. In fact, people spout nonsense in politics and are
I've noticed
the high position. What?
I've noticed that.
Yeah. Anyway, let's get back to this book, though. I'm really, I hope you don't mind. We're going all over the place, and I think people enjoy it because I'm enjoying it. But your point about the chapter on gay, it seems to me, because you really want to still poke people's sensibilities here, is this seesaw, is the notion. So it went from gay being an anathema to gay being not to gay being accepted, and then as all of these things you point out, once you've achieved in all of these oppressed minorities, once they achieve what you think would then be time to say this is reality, it crashes through, and suddenly they become more oppressed. And not only that, become the argument that it's not that being gay is bad, it's that being gay is better. Yes. And you're right. Yes. I'll quote you here. You say, because in some way the perception is developed, and this relates to a heterosexual person having a homosexual experience versus a homosexual person having a heterosexual experience. And you say, because in some way the perception is developed that to once be gay is to have fallen into your true state of nature, whereas to be forever afterwards straight is not. This is different from a claim of bisexuality. Is it a presumption that the seesaw of sexuality is not even evenly balanced, but in fact inclines towards gay? And that whereas a previous era might have tilted the seesaw towards straight, this one has decided to tilt it in the other direction, perhaps in order to right a wrong, in the hope that the seesaw will one day arrive at an even point. But how are people to work out when the seesaw has arrived at the right position is impossible to tell, because like everything else, we're making all this up as we go along. Yes. And I think that's the key point, is we don't know the answers to all of these things. And most of us, life is an experiment for each of us individually, and we find that we're experimenting and often wrong. But societally,
we're very confused about that. I mean, I do think that the whole concept of how to get to equality is just really oh no, sorry, my thing froze briefly. I had an old friend of mine, one of my best friends, who was from Ireland, died some years ago now, and he was a great plain speaker, among other things. And he once said to me, "You know what, Douglas?" He said, "You know, the real definition of equality is when you don't get anything more than anyone else. You just have to put up with the same crap the rest of us have to put up." And I always loved that as a definition of actual equality. Is you just have to put up with the same crap everyone else.
Everyone else says that's, and it's. Or Well, yeah, I'd put it more generally because when I was talking to a colleague, a friend of mine who I had great respect for, he started talking about how privileged he was because of the things he had, and you actually alluded to in the book. Part of this nonsense about privilege is, yeah, you have privilege here, but there's other areas because you were well off, you had less privilege. You didn't get to
All right.
experience the things, and he had to finally realize, yeah, there's this notion that it's not that we are all equal in the sense we all have to put up the same crap. What I tend to think of as a level of equality is, yeah, there's crap I don't have to put up with that you do, but there's crap that I have to put up with you don't. We all live in this
And
world
also,
full of crap. It's just different crap.
and exactly, and to some extent, I mean, I always say that the leftists tend to, certain social justice activists, campaigners, and so on, tend to think that life's meant to be about struggle and fighting and campaigning and forward and always forward. And I say, yes, there is an important place for that in the dialectic of politics and actual social justice and much more. But there's also a place for just finding your peace with the world. And one of the ways you can find your peace with the world is to realize, for instance, that there's always some optimal condition you dream of. I mean, you mentioned privilege. I used to think that people whose parents were very wealthy and well connected inevitably privileged as a child.
Mm-hmm.
That is true sometimes.
Of course it is. Sometimes I know some children, very wealthy people.
And sometimes absolutely a disaster.
Yeah.
The child is spoiled or is unused to being able to compete in the world. They lack ambition, or one of the most common ones is they live under the shadow of a parent who has achieved a great amount, and in fact, it cripples them.
Yeah.
So, there are ways to console yourself, about the things you don't have.
Yeah, well, I like to think it's just that we all suffer for the sins of our parents.
But just that, as I say, that we all have to find a way to make peace.
Yeah, we have to make peace with it, but it's a great equalizer, and it's, speaking of equality, and you talk later about the fact that we'll talk about equality, probably when it comes to women, I think is where you first bring it up. It might be race. We don't even know what equality. When you actually ask what is equality, it's not very well defined. Just like racism and everything else, and yet these things are talked about with certainty, and yet they're not. And wouldn't we all be better off if we just realize that? Hey, let's ask what if we really understand what that means before we assert certainty about what it implies.
Exactly. See, one of my conclusions about all of this is that I would say, let's try to frame an argument that almost everyone could agree with. Instead of like straw manning, let's try to steel man a case. And one of the ways I've come to this is to say, look, I think there's almost unanimity in most developed societies now that people should not be held back from accomplishing anything they can accomplish because of a characteristic of which they have no say. Yeah. So if there is a woman who is eminently qualified for a role, of course she should not be given the role just because she's a woman, or because it's a man, or gay, or trans, or black, or anything else.
Yeah, or anything.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Now, I think you could get pretty much agreement on that across political sides. Very few people actually want to discriminate against people and hold people down. Because of a characteristic.
Yeah.
However,
they are. Mm-hmm.
There is a major disagreement about how you go about this. And the campaigning right has its own criticisms that can be made of it, including a sort of conceitedness, including a sort of it'll take some time, but and there is a critique that says, well, how much time do you want this to take? The gradualist approach, is it okay if it takes 3 generations more, for instance? There are criticisms you can make of the conservative attitude of this, the sort of gradualist approach, to broadly answer the question I just put out there. But the other approach is we've got to force the change faster. And actually, I do think that way is lying hell. There have obviously been lots of cases already. We've got the Harvard admissions case coming up, probably the Supreme Court will adjudicate. That could find that almost every university in America has been breaking the law.
I expect it will.
And that's very serious.
Having been taught at universities, I'll be amazed if it won't, but we'll see.
Absolutely, it's a very interesting case. But in the case of women, I mean, I'm completely of the view. I mean, I would hate it if any woman was held back from doing something because that she was competent to do.
Yeah,
It'd be ludicrous. But it's also ludicrous to say, for instance, all high status jobs must have exactly 50% representation from women. Oh, and by the way, the low status jobs we won't worry about.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Or I mean, yeah, I was surprised in some ways, maybe because it hadn't become a big issue yet. I think you bring it up more in the War in the West. Is it something that affected me a lot? Is this nonsense of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is the central
yes, that
part
came up. That ogre was born as I was finishing.
Yeah, as you're finishing the book, but that's become the mantra, which is that everything, and it's absolutely a ridiculous notion, which we can apply in certain cases, but yeah, in other cases, no, and it's not just in low status jobs. Yeah, we don't want all roofers to be 50% women, but we all or 50% black, but we also don't care if basketball players are we don't require them to be 50% white either, and
small people.
Yeah, and so it's this notion of is ludicrous, and of course we both argue about it. You don't talk about merit is a huge thing, which again isn't in this particular book, but so much. But the notion you don't want anyone to be held back, but it's ridiculous to require people to require for any position that has a skill that it's anything but the skill that's taken into account in determining the position.
Yes, and you see that's what I get into in the War in the West, which is my biggest worry really about all of this, the DEI, EDA sort of stuff, is the opportunity cost, Lawrence. And that's you see, let's just return to this idea of what happens if somebody with a competency is held back. Americans who identify as black make up something like 13% of the population. This is a significant chunk of the American population. You would not want that chunk of the population, that group in the population, to be disenfranchised, unable to achieve what they could achieve. Equally, in a country where the majority of people are still white, you wouldn't want the white population to be disincentivized and disenfranchised and be told to keep back either. But it's the latter that is now occurring.
It's the latter that's now the norm.
I think there is something, and we have to think very openly and very frankly about this. There is something deeply disturbing for the future of a society if it says to its majority populations, hang back, hold back, shut up, keep quiet, go about life as inoffensively as possible, and die without any carbon emissions.
What area we disagree on, but anyway, yes.
I just think it's such a tragedy to say that, as opposed to something which motivates and generates and says, look, whatever it is you're good at, whatever your competency, whoever you are, strive like hell, fight like hell, and discover like hell, and we're all going to be better on the other side.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be dead on the other side. But the insidious aspect of this, of course, is that it all originated from good intentions, right? And that's the problem, which is those words, diversity, equity, inclusion, sounds like something you can't, how could you ever argue against any of those terms? And so it is clear that when the minority, and as often happens throughout history and understanding history, as you point out, and I certainly feel is really important, and recognizing that it's history and not present is also equally important. But minorities have suffered, and then gays have suffered, and women have suffered, and women even when they were a minority, and so and trans and people with ambiguous sexuality in many ways, and so it's easy to understand that the desire to ensure that minority rights are upheld, but that's not equivalent to taking rights away from the majority or anyone else, whether, or from other minorities, whether it's Asian Americans in the case of, American education, or Jews, or anyone else.
I mean, but it just if if we take a step back in our era and say, like, imagine if, for instance, Silicon Valley Bank was dedicated really only to being a really good bank that optimized profits for its, people who deposited in it, was a safe loan, and so on. Imagine if it had focused on that. I'm not saying it would still be going, but it would have a better chance.
Yeah, well, I've heard that argument. I'm not sure I buy it. Yeah, they were really big on being the #1 diversity bank and everything else. So I suspect it was bad business practice as much as maybe they didn't have their eye on the ball, but it's hard to know.
Only having one member of the board who understood finance, that was a problem.
Yeah.
But my point is that if you go through all the various things, and I basically think I've agreed with my friend Vivek Ramaswamy that effectively much of what he calls woke capital is just sort of whitewashing. I mean, like, if you're an energy, we all know, if you're an energy company and you're dealing with fossil fuels for the last 20 years, all of your advertisements are, about just wanting to make the planet greener.
Yeah.
Endless pictures of trees and things. You never see a pumping oil well. And
that's right.
It's just that's not popular anymore.
Yeah.
But it's the same with all these corporations, all these banks and things. They worried after 2008, in my view in particular, rightly they should have been worried that the crowd was going to come for them. And they spend the next 15 years pumping money into social justice programs and talking about how great they are about gays and covering their branches in rainbow flags and all this crap. And it's sort of, it is a sort of whitewashing. And also I have a sort of contempt for these people because they were never there when there were actually civil rights to argue for.
Yeah. It's after the fact. It's easy.
They came afterwards in order to
virtue signaling, which it's a way to protect yourself of virtue signaling, which a term I learned actually from, I'm embarrassed to say, from my friend Ian McEwen when he was talking to me about an experience I had. But
really? Virtue signaling as a word was invented at the Spectator, by the way.
Really?
My colleague Bartholomew was one who came up for that very necessary term.
It's a brilliant term, and it is the popular defense, and it's what drives the cowardice of university presidents, of heads of scientific societies, and government officials. That you can get ahead of the game by pointing out, by going overboard to point out how sympathetic and how you are, and it's I view it as the intellectual heir of the. I mean, this is not new either to me. Of the Red Scare era in the 1950s, it was, you would protect yourself by pointing out someone else as a communist, right? And part of virtue signaling is saying how good you are, but unfortunately, in the modern world, especially in the modern world governed by social media, the other half of virtue signaling is pointing out not just how good you are, but how bad they are.
Sure.
And that's
absolutely.
And that's the really insidious evil part of it.
Yeah.
So come back to hardware versus software. That was the success, and yet it's also been the bane in certain areas. Because sometimes it's true and sometimes it may not be true. And if we don't know the answer, then requiring it to be hardware when it's useful for you, or software when it's useful for you. For example, and I think you make it quite, the topic you talk about after gay is women. So it's advantageous for the gay community to show that being gay is hardware.
Yes.
But it's advantageous for women to say either to say A, there's no differences, or B, if there are, it's software rather than hardware. And in both cases, while there's evidence one way or another, we may not be certain of the exact answer either way.
Yes, I mean the reason I land on this hardware software thing is simply to say that I think that in the current era where people don't think we have a guiding ethos, we do, and this is about the most fundamental guiding ethos, which is that you don't prejudice against somebody because of something over which they can have no.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a very important ethos. It's like, why don't you, I don't know, why do we recognize now, for instance, as we didn't until, a few decades ago, that I mean, for instance, taking a piss out of somebody for some handicap. So yeah, but basically we sort of came to that realization at some point in recent decades that if it's hardware, something you can't do anything about, you don't prejudice against people for that. One of the unforeseen consequences of that is people wanting things to be hardware that might actually be software. I mean, there are several chapters I could have added to the madness of crowds, which I might do in a future book. But I mean, there are obvious ones like addiction issues. A lot of addicts would like the addiction to be hardware because it to some extent absolves them of personal
responsibility.
On the other hand, it's tricky because we do know that, for instance, certain hereditary things like alcohol, alcohol, a propensity towards alcoholism in the family is definitely a thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's tricky. Another one is mental health, which I did think of biting off in The Madness of Crowds and realized was a book in itself. But mental health, which is also about the only way that a straight white male can get onto the victim hierarchy thing, is to say, I'm certified bipolar or something. Oh my God, that's good. Not only bipolar, but certified. That's fantastic. That's the best. Where can I get a certificate like this?
Yeah, exactly. Put up in your wall.
On the wall, framed. My parents on either side, holding the home with a gown, and and all that stuff. Is also, it's like there's a desire for. I mean, I think that mental illness is something we're becoming increasingly understanding and knowledgeable about, and that's all for the good. But it wouldn't be for the good if, for instance, anyone who ever had any mental health problems was forever able to turn it into a hardware issue and therefore sort of make themselves a victim throughout their lives.
Which is what, I mean, which is in some sense, again, I'm jumping all around, but it's in some sense what is becoming the norm, right? Everyone now has mental health issues if they hear certain words. Suddenly, it used to be okay if you were an adult, if you weren't a child, to be able to hear things you didn't want to hear or ignore them or argue against them. But now it's a mental health issue and that everyone seems to be allowed to suffer from. And it's ridiculous.
But it's hard, Lawrence, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't like to be a diagnostician in some of these circumstances. I mean, for instance, PTSD, which I have a great interest in. I have a lot of friends who spend a lot of time in wars and things.
Yeah.
And PTSD is a very, very, important realization that it exists. Now people claiming to have it, it seems laughable. I mean, like you weren't in the trenches of World War I.
Yeah.
You were Brandeis.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever.
You had a professor ignore you, and
but it's possible that if you're brought up in a very fragile environment in which you think that every one of your moves is constantly documented by your peers on social media and all this sort of thing, and that every action in the world is impossible to understand where it'll go, and you don't know, you've got even less idea of your future and even more idea than we ever had before of what the present looks like. Maybe some of these kids do have a sort of form of PTSD. But
it's you're right, and in fact, it's not knowing. I think, as you say, if we've decided what the answer, it's not just knowing what the answers are, but of deciding what the answers can't be, as you say. If we have decided what the answers cannot be, or what answers we could not cope with, which then seems to be little point beyond a fondness for truth in asking good questions. And that's we come back to the area which sort of motivates me to talk about this as this intersection of science and art and culture. Is that and that's always been my problem with religion, is that it assumes the answers before it asks the questions, at least organized religions, and that whenever you do that, then there's no room for discussion or learning, and when that comes into the secular realm as well, where what the answers cannot be because they would not be acceptable to you, or what answers we cannot cope with. Which, I'm purposely going to jump ahead to things that I know are later on. This notion that is now becoming, in the context you talk about it mostly in the context of trans, but also it comes up in the context of race. We see now this becoming part of the accepted hierarchy of science, saying there are certain questions you cannot ask because there are certain answers we could not cope with. And two examples that come up with, which aren't in your book more recently than your book, but are that I've written about, are examples of a paper written for the National Academy of Sciences by two psychologists from Michigan State University, which is about police shootings and race.
Yeah.
Okay, and they eventually asked for the paper to be withdrawn after it had been appeared. First of all, they were castigated at the university, and the vice president for research at Michigan State, who'd supported the research, was removed. He's a physicist. He was removed because of complaints that were made by physicists that he was supporting this stuff. But worse still, they asked for it to be removed from that because they said they were worried about it being misused, and that the answers they would come up with couldn't be coped with, so therefore they should never appear. Similarly, the journal Nature Behavior, and I have big problems with most of Nature journals lately, but Nature used to be a very, and it still is in many ways, a reputable science journal, and so is Science, although Science has become much more politicized than Nature, I think, the journal Science. But Nature Behavior specifically said, we will not publish articles that may be construed to be harmful to certain groups, independent of whether the results are right or not. I don't know if you're aware of that, but that is just how can that be?
It's especially disturbing because it shows, first of all, there's absolutely no chance of getting to the truth.
Yeah,
of
exactly. Zero.
I mean, it clearly means that like truth is not your guide. It's something else. It's like, what would you call it? Social containment strategy or something like that. The second thing is, I just glanced down at my phone because I made a note of this to myself the other day. This is sort of my view. It may well be your view as well. I suspect it is, and it's completely counter to all of the ideas of the day.
Yeah.
But let me just quote this to you. I think we ought to read only the kinds of books that wound and stab us. If the book we are reading doesn't wake us up with a blow on the head, what are we reading it for? We need the books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us.
Who wrote that?
That was Franz Kafka in a letter in 1904.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Isn't that brilliant? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us.
Yeah. Wow. That is, yeah, that's fantastic.
Actually. I mean, Dan, that is exactly the opposite of the world you're describing.
Exactly. And it's the world. I mean, it's what's sad is it started in a world of undergraduates who somehow felt that they should not be exposed to things that they did not want to hear. And you can understand that because they're children. Okay. I mean, for the most part, they're learning how to be adults. You hope they're learning how to be adults. Unfortunately, in modern universities, they're not. But what's sad is when that permeates the actual establishment that should be involved in exactly the opposite. I used to say the purpose of science, and now I say the purpose of education, but they're both the same. The perfect purpose of education is to make us uncomfortable. Purpose of science is to make us uncomfortable because if we're not uncomfortable, we're not learning. Absolutely. We're not pushing our boundaries. And the whole point of being comfortable and not is an anathema to learning.
This is it, Lawrence. This is a failure of the adults to communicate this.
And the educational community is when that's what scares me, and I think we should be scared of. It's okay when largely ignorant undergraduates think they should be coddled or they shouldn't, or they should be safe. And by the way, when I did speak at the Oxford Union online, I've done 2 debates there, one live and one online. I actually was a debate on the question, we are all religious. And I actually took the positive side. a bunch of my atheist colleagues were on the other side, because I do think one of my arguments was if we weren't all naturally religious, we wouldn't need science. But also the fact that we see the people who aren't religious in the canonical sense have become religious. We need religion, secular religion, and we're seeing it. But one of this undergraduates was put on, how they do it at the Oxford Union. They put some undergraduates on your side, was talking about this safetyism, the fact as and pointing out something very interesting, which I hadn't thought of before, which is true, which is this notion of giving students safe spaces has produced a group of students who feel far less safe, because it was never an issue before. But now, by being
that's right,
presented with the possibility of a safe space, you're always wondering if you're unsafe. And that's a really serious problem.
Well, and I'm afraid it's the same thing with mental health to a great extent. If everyone is told that they suffer from it all the time, then you will, increasingly actually question whether your anxiety is a normal, reasonable anxiety or actually a medicalized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and but it's sad when these mental health issues become sort of part of the norm, and similarly when these things that no one should question about the question of whether you should question and whether you should be able to question, and whether scientific truth should not be disseminated because it might appear to someone to be harmful, is
It's so awful, because life is so harmful,
yeah. That's what makes it
harmful.
wonderful.
Existence is so harmful. Every step is a step toward the grave.
I just was reading a quote, and I can't. And I told you I'm awful at remembering quotes, but by actually Helen Keller, which was saying something like, "You couldn't experience joy if life wasn't, was always joyous."
Of course, it's the same thing. With death.
Yeah.
Keep a reasonable assessment of death in your head. Don't let it preoccupy yourself, but keep a reasonable recognition of it in your head, and you'll live better.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, look, I'm going to jump ahead. There's so many, as I say, I'm part of the presumably maturity is being able to pick things in spite of the fact there's everything I want to talk to about. We'll jump ahead to women, since I want to hit all the points, and then brief. My hope is to hit all the points quickly now, go a little bit of the War of West, and then I do want to return to the sublime. I want to return to poetry at the end. It's interesting that you point out when you talk about women, you talk about I assume a mutual friend, certainly a friend of mine. I'm assuming a friend of yours, Steve Pinker, who I have great respect for. And in his book, The Blank Slate, he said things which nowadays would. It's amazing he hasn't been. I guess people still try and cancel him, but
he hasn't went backwards in his oeuvre.
Yeah. It's amazing. He just points out that it's just obvious. He said he seems confident when he's noted that gender has become a hot button issue, but he's confident that the scientific view would win out. And he talks about this different sex, and you point out and as you say, as Pinker said, things are not looking good for the theory that boys and girls are born identical except for the genitalia, with all other differences from coming from the way society treats them. And I think the next sentence is, except that less than 2 decades later they are. And I think you call it one of the biggest self-delusions. The societal self-delusion over biological reality is just one in a whole series of such delusions that our societies have decided to engage in. Worse is that we've begun trying to reorder our societies not in line with facts we know from science, but based on political falsehoods pushed by activists in the social sciences. Yeah. Which comes up in the case of race as well. We'll talk about the nonsense of critical race theory.
Basically, I think what we're struggling with in sexual differences between the sexes, and any differences between racial groups, is we don't know what we would do with the data. We're so worried that it goes back to something you mentioned earlier. Somebody bad will come along and misuse the data. Well, somebody bad will always come along,
and that this reminds me of something that is topical. It's topical because I just wrote about it, and it surprised me and shocked me. And you talk about how Silicon Valley is is, you know, how Google and others have this selection effects of determining what you're allowed to hear and such. We all know that, but it's gone into ChatGPT, which is, I wrote a piece on this when it came to gender. I give a dialogue with ChatGPT where ChatGPT basically says, I won't report to you these studies because they may be harmful or offensive. and that's got to be programmed in there, right? I mean,
by the way, a lot of one of the things that started to obsess me in recent years, Lawrence, is the way in which in field after field there is a form of stasis.
mm-hmm.
You know this very well from the academy. People think that there's a sort of stasis only in their field, and then they discover it seems to be existing in others. The most likely cause for it, in my view, is that we have already cut off certain fields of inquiry.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's quickly do the exercise on one of the great, perhaps the greatest flowering of thought that ever existed, which is in ancient Athens.
Mm-hmm.
We could, this miracle of thought, which has never been equaled in the history of any of the fields, we could ask why it happened. And some of the answers would be ones which would not be positive if we said we wished to replicate it. For instance, there's no doubt that the great philosophers partly had more time to philosophize because they had slaves.
Yeah.
Women definitely had a secondary position in the society. And so many of the material discomforts that many of us have to find our own answers to in our lives in the 21st century were being dealt with by the women. And the philosophers and the mathematicians. There are questions about how society was set up in ancient Athens that you could say, because of these conditions, among others, existed, and we wouldn't want to replicate that today.
Yeah.
So you might come to a conclusion, but you could just look at it and say, look, this is just what it was, and learn everything you can from it.
Mm-hmm.
My worry in our day is that we have decided to cut off a set of things, and as a result are causing ourselves in field after field to be in some kind of form of stasis. And the most dangerous one is that one of people couldn't cope with this idea, because if Newton had thought like that, you know, if everybody else had thought like that.
Exactly. There's a great example that I learned from a colleague. This is from the Royal Society. It's a fascinating example to show what would have happened. And it's Van Leeuwenhoek, I think is how you say his name, the person who developed the microscope, was reporting to the Royal Society, and he first discovered sperm.
Right.
And he wrote to that Royal Society, more or less said, here are my results, but if they're too offensive, don't publish them. And of course they published them. But, he asked the question, can people cope with this? And it's a wonderful example in the history of science that somehow in the, whatever it was, the 16th century, probably 17th century, probably, the editors of the Royal Society were much more advanced than the editors of the Royal Society of Chemistry are now, who have also said, we can't have any offensive words or ideas published in our journals.
By the way, among much else, you're well known as an atheist, but this must trouble you, I'm sure, as it does me, which is that there might be a possibility in our own age that one of the things that is cutting off some of these avenues of inquiry is in part a form of atheistic certainty, which fears that if we admit to gaps, the religious are going to rush in and give us God again. And
I'm sure that exists in a certain segment of the population, but I think I think, especially since the real definition of atheism is not that you're certain there's no God, it's just that you're not convinced there is, and by any argument that's ever been made. And then so So, uh, again, the confident atheists are the ones who will say, "I don't know," but here's but there's no evidence, and you present me
But I
evidence.
mean, for instance, I've had this discussion with evolutionary biologists where you definitely get to a bit where the atheist evolutionary biologist is very wary about the bits that are difficult in case the religious sneak in and say, "Ha ha, that gap is God." I just mentioned it because
That's where I did that little meme that I've now seen written on cups, which I say lack of understanding is not evidence for God. It's just evidence of lack of understanding. So the good
yeah,
evolutionary biologists should say, yeah, we don't understand it.
of course,
But that always amazes me, especially as a scientist, is that claim, you don't understand this, which, and by, as a consequence, implied is you will never understand this. Love, you don't understand love. You'll never understand love. Well, it's true we don't understand. There's a lot we don't understand, but that doesn't mean we'll never understand it. So it's true that there are various aspects of evolution that are puzzles. And to pretend there are no puzzles because you're worried about saying there are puzzles and you
right.
think that'll open up the God is a dangerous alley. You're absolutely right. It's instead of saying, yeah, I mean, but if history is any guide, the things we don't understand, we can eventually understand. And I've had this discussion with my friend Martin Rees of whether he thinks there may be some limits to human understanding. There may be, but what is wonderful is that I haven't seen any yet. and that's remarkable that we haven't come up against any brick walls. We may come up against momentary brick walls. And my one disagreement with you about stasis being caused by closing off questions, which I absolutely agree occurs. I think in science, if I were to look at the analogy, the stasis often occurs because we haven't yet come up with the right questions. It's not that they're closed off. It's no one has yet asked the right question. So in a sense, it's being closed off because everyone's, following along on a trajectory, but it's not as if we'd say you can't ask those questions. No one's been smart enough to come up and say, hey, this is the good question. And that's what usually causes progress in science, is someone coming up with the right question.
Yes, I saw Elon Musk or something last summer, and he said something so funny at one point. He said basically, unless it breaks the laws of physics, everything's possible.
Yeah, in fact, actually, someone just asked if they could quote me in a book where I more or less said something even stronger. Unless it's shown to be impossible, it's guaranteed to happen.
That's very
guaranteed to happen. And I think that's even stronger. So someone's writing a book, and they asked if I don't know why they asked if they could use it, because of course they could use it, that's what's amazing about living in a complex, large, and old universe, is that as no matter how implausible it is, if it's not impossible, it's happened.
Yes.
And that's amazing. And of course, it's even more amazing if there's a multiverse, but we can get into that some other time. But it is one of the things that I find never-ending source of surprise and awe for me as a scientist when I look at the universe, is that, I mean, it's just, I mean, we look at planets. I mean, it's just amazing to see the configurations that we once thought couldn't happen because they were just so remote, but they happen all the time. And it's just a pact of a big universe. I mean, stars explode once every 200 years in our galaxy. But there's one exploding every second somewhere in the universe, and it's responsible for you and me being here. And even stranger, I'll give you another one it's not what I planned to talk about in this thing, but it's something that I gave a lecture on that amazed me when I first learned it. I don't wear any gold, but if you may have some gold on you, but we just learned.
I have no bling.
Yeah. Okay. But they but it's amazing, it was a big mystery in physics how you got beyond iron in stars. And one of the places we thought might be is this most implausible things with these two massive things called neutron stars, which are stars that have collapsed to the size of London and are so dense that a teaspoonful is 100 billion tons. And two of them could collide. And it was proposed perhaps that in that very exotic situation, you could argue that the big thing called neutron capture, and you'd produce gold. And when the new LIGO detector detected the collision of two neutron stars, which happens very rarely in the universe, but all the time, because rare is happening all the time, other telescopes immediately were able to look at that thing, and look at the two neutron stars and look at the radiative decay and saw the creation of 2 Earths mass worth of gold in that system. So if those people are wearing gold, this happens to be silver, but those people are wearing gold. Every atom in that thing came from one of the most implausible events that you could imagine, which is a collision sometime. Isn't that amazing? I mean, isn't that mind-blowing? Anyway, it's not what I was planning to talk about, but that's the kind of thing that is amazing. And we should be open-minded to not knowing it until we do, and wait, of course, till there's evidence, because that was a theory about neutron capture in these things, and I just seemed implausible to me because it was in one place, but but then the evidence comes out and you're willing to accept it.
Yeah.
And so let's go back to self-delusion of women, which is maybe a lot less interesting than gold and neutron stars. But I do want to ask you one or two questions there, and then we'll jump to race and trans, and then I think we'll go to poetry. We'll have to forget the war in the West, which isn't, and well, actually, we won't completely, because I wanted to talk about one or two issues where you and I disagree about, because I think it's important. But one of the things that interests me about talking about feminism in the context of self-delusion, do you know Janice Fiamengo? Do you know who she is?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because you talk about the first, second, and third waves of feminism, fourth waves of feminism, and we all agree by the fourth wave of feminism, it's just become the equivalent to male hating. But she's argued that it's true, that was historically true from all the waves.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing. I wonder if you've thought about that issue.
I say that the rhetoric is the most important thing to judge it by.
Yeah. Okay.
And as I think I say there, if the suffragettes had said, we demand the vote, all men are scum, I'm not sure the franchise would have been gained.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It would. It's a very unappealing way that the fourth wave feminists have found to talk about men.
Yeah, all men are trash, as you point out, which is interpreted. Oh, well, they don't really mean that, but by the sympathetic people. But that's what they
again. I mean, it's such a disingenuous way of arguing. If a man said all women are whores, and then women said, "I'm sorry," I go, "I don't mean all women are whores. I'm just saying all women are whores."
Yeah,
you would be like, no, we're judging you by your words.
Yeah.
So the people who say, when I say all men are trash, I'm not saying they're trash. It means something else.
Yeah.
I haven't got time for people trying to work out their own thoughts and what comes out of their own mouths.
Yeah.
But yes, that is. I don't agree that sort of misandry was always there. I think it always had the potential to lurk, for sure, and it did lurk in some hearts, but not as a part of the movement.
Well, but one of the things, and I for lack of time, I'm not going to start reading all of your quotes, which I like to read. I'll just go through some of the ideas. Is that, I mean, one of the issues that you raised in your women's section is this notion of same but better, the requirement to be the same instead of accepting that there are differences, as if saying that there are differences, there are biological differences, is heresy. And well,
we're so confused about this. I mean, actually, in the wake of the collapse of SVB and others, I was reminded again of something I mentioned in the Manners of Crowds, which is what Christine Lagarde said at the IMF after the Lehman Brothers, which she said repeatedly for the next decade: if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman sisters, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And I think this is a very important question to ask, which is, in which case you're saying that women are different. That women would behave differently. Now, what are the differences that you mean? And these may be real, or they may be imagined, but the real ones would be women are less big on risk.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is plenty of data to support that. And what's more, that men are more risk tolerant in things like the market. So, okay, let's agree that women are less risk-taking than men. Does that mean that you should comprise a board of 50% men and 50% women in the hope that the 50% men will be rampaging ahead to try to do dangerous things, and the 50% women will be holding them back and saying, "Whoa there, Sonny, don't invest it all on that"? Maybe, but no one's actually saying that.
But also, if you say that, then you open yourself, like it's always the case, you open yourself to getting bit in the butt, if by literally and metaphorically, because then you say, well, if you really believe that women are less risk taking, maybe then women are not as good in certain fields because they require, and of course then you'll find that that's a heretical thing to say, right? If you really make a claim, you've got to, it's either true or it isn't.
Yeah.
And you've got to accept the implications of it everywhere. It's not that you're not allowed to, it's once again, you're not allowed to say, yeah, this is true here, but we won't even consider that other case because we couldn't cope with that answer.
Right. No, it's a very, it's a strange fallacy we've fallen into in our time. Yeah, the equal but better is the way I say it.
Yeah, yeah.
Equal.
And it's also, you point out, and this is a touchy area, but I want to at least touch on it. You know, you talked about, you know, how the world has changed, and you talked about Hollywood and Letterman and Colbert and stuff. But and actually a great quote from Jordan Peterson. I have to talk about workplace relations, which we'll get to, which I want to discuss briefly. But you point out something which is how much has changed, which is that famous scene from Indiana Jones where the young student, you know, who would not fall in love with Indiana Jones as a professor, and you know, has "Love You" on there, and you point out, well, that was kind of a meme, you know, to believe that you know, a young woman would want to, you know, not only be attracted to a professor, but would be in a position to want to seduce that. That was kind of a, and yet now that would be an anathema to argue because it's a question of power. And and it would, and
of all sexual relations through the prism of power is disastrous.
Yeah, as you point out, that's how you view power. But I want to ask you a question in that sense, that having arguing that, or arguing that it's only a question of power, is demeaning, and isn't it demeaning to women to say that they don't have the capability of having social power, when in fact, as far as I can tell, all evidence is that women actually do have more social intelligence than men, more awareness of what's going on in around them in their social interactions. And to say that they're somehow helpless vessels that can be manipulated by men is demeaning to women.
Oh, I mean, and just visibly untrue for all the women in our lives that we know. I mean,
it's visibly untrue, but it's become the mantra now that, and the example I wanted to give, which relates to these complexity of workplace relations, which is such a tragedy, is famous geneticist David Sabatini, who was removed from, you know, potentially Nobel Prize winning work and his lab because he had a relationship with another woman in another lab who turned out to be not as senior as he was. And but then what's amazing to me is, you know, you talk about the fact that 10 to 20% of people find their partners in the workplace. So and what amazed me
is that a lot higher, but that's still, yeah.
But this is what shocked me, is the Whitehead Institute, which removed him inappropriately. I think most people who've looked at the story would argue. And interestingly, the head of the Whitehead Institute as is the head of the Howard Hughes Foundation, which also removed him. Both are women who, by the way, married their former students, okay, or postdocs. Interestingly, but the Whitehead Institute, which I think must have 1,500 people, instituted a policy that you were not allowed to have social relationships with anyone else who works at the institute. I mean, isn't that complete lunacy?
That's like, what's her name? The woman who wrote the book Tiger Mom.
Oh yeah. From Yale, who I happen to know. I forget her name now. But
was it at Yale or Harvard? She was teaching some classes.
She taught in the law school at Yale. She still teaches law school.
And she got into some mad assault on her character because she was inviting students for tea at her house.
Yeah.
This was thought to be inappropriate. This is how you socialize students.
But now you'd never do that. And I mean, I've got, you know, it's absolutely ridiculous that you could invite a male student for tea, but if you invite a female student for tea, you'd never do. No colleague. It would be
madness,
academic suicide to do that now.
Yeah. But it's a very interesting thing also, because it demonstrates that we don't have the understanding we had more than 2,000 years ago about the nature of the dynamics in students.
Yeah, but the fact that but the fact, probably, which you're right, 2,000 years ago, which the Greek poets and writers knew about, which is that human adult relations are complicated, and
so, which is why they're so interesting.
yeah, exactly, which is why they're so interesting, and so to argue both oppression because of lack of power, seeming power, when in fact, as the Indiana Jones example gives, there's power. There's many different kinds of power, and to argue that a young woman, as you say in your book somewhere, that to be young and attractive and is doesn't imply any power is just to be ignorant of reality.
Crazily unaware of reality.
Yeah, we're both going to get in trouble for that. I certainly will. But anyway, let's go to race, and then I want to zip through, because I certainly want to. I want to at least point out the claim that it's obvious now. You begin your discussion of race with the beautiful speech of Martin Luther King, and the famous claim that, we hoped his children would be judged by the quality of their character and not the color of their skin. I'm paraphrasing, and you probably remember it exactly because you do those things. But let's see. One day they will live in a nation where they'll be not judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character. And we've moved to a situation where it's exactly the opposite. And as you point out beautifully somewhere, the actual definition of racism is exactly equivalent to what's being proposed in an effort to fight racism.
Yes, it's again, we were so close.
Yeah.
To a sort of reasonable approach to this, and it, like these other issues, it went skewing off into the distance, off the tracks, just as it should have drawn into the station. It's very sad. I mean, I know we don't have time to talk about the war in the West, but the war in the West, I sort of go into some of this in greater depth. It's very sad to me, the way in which America in particular has re-racialized its society in the name of racism.
Tragic.
And you just see it everywhere. I've just done a short tour of campuses in the US, and I was struck by a number of things. One was the timidity of a lot of students, the sheer, again, it goes to that thing that maybe they're right, to be timid in this era, but the timidity of them, the being told to be holding back.
Most of them, these studies that have shown that a majority of them are afraid to speak their mind.
Yeah.
I mean, where, and actually, this is probably a place to say it. You say that in the context of race, that basically the safest places in the world are the places where the worst crimes are, where it's claimed the worst crimes are happening. And there's no place safer than a modern liberal arts college.
It's the version of Moynihan's law, about human rights and human rights abuses, and claims of human rights abuses. Unfortunately, claims of racism happen in the places least likely to be committing racism. And I do joke that, if you were to try to set up the Fourth Reich, then a college in Oregon would seem a most unlikely place to try to start it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's become the norm is that students are afraid in what should be the safest place in the world to speak your mind.
Oh, and to try things out, and
to try. That's what universities are for. They're 4 years of being completely safe to try out anything intellectually,
absolutely,
sexually, emotionally, everything else.
Yeah.
And it's a tragedy that they become the exact opposite.
Yeah, and that's how you learn. I have a very shorthand version of this, but I remember when I was a student, David Irving, the Holocaust denier, was due to come speak at the Oxford Union. I remember rowing with my friends in the bar at my college about it. I was of the opinion that he shouldn't be allowed to speak, because if there was even one Jewish student who was offended, that means that, and that was my view at the time, I thought. But I rowed it out with friends, and I have a different view now, which is that he should be allowed to speak and be countered by historians who know better, who expose him, which has happened since. So, but yes, it's tragic. I thought that the timidity of the students in American colleges I've come across is very worrying. But another thing is just the prevalence of race as the discussion underneath every discussion. It's very disturbing. It's not what I think most of us, in the true sense, who are liberal-minded, hoped we would be stuck on. And again, I think there's just a profound opportunity cost.
Oh, tremendous. Tremendous. And it's what I'm older than you, a fair amount, I suspect, but it's, I'm a child of the 60s, and it, when I look back and I think I was a teenager in the 60s, and I never imagined the world 50 years later. I thought these things were a thing of the past. Who would have ever thought not just the show of neo-Puritanism, but the focus on things that we thought at that time were completely irrelevant.
Well, imagine, imagine if we'd been speaking in 1999, Lawrence, on the eve of millennium, and we've been talking about this new thing, the internet and computers, and we can get access to, in 20 years, I'll have access to almost any book, almost any formula. You'll be able to go online and have classes from Yale for free on things. We would think, my God, what is not possible in the 21st century? Fast forward 2023, nobody's willing to say what a woman is, and America's disagreeing about the date of its founding. We've become stupider.
Absolutely. And the other aspect is that while the internet is the fountain of all knowledge in some ways, it's also the fountain of misinformation, and the problem, and that's why I've argued, actually, we have to change the teaching of the way we educate. It used to be facts were relevant, but that's irrelevant in teaching now. What we need to teach kids is how to sift the misinformation from the information. That's the skill of the 21st century.
And another thing, which I wrote about recently in a column, which is, the era of access to information is incredible. It's something our forebears dreamed of, but you also have to have wisdom. And wisdom comes from thinking about facts.
And being exposed to things that make you uncomfortable, because you can't gain the wisdom if you're in this echo chamber of comfort your whole life. Wisdom comes from being challenged in many different ways, and often tragically challenged, I think. And I know, and I've experienced that in my own life in many ways. That I will say, when you talked about, it's interesting to me when you talked about one Jewish student being offended, in an article I just wrote that just appeared, which is titled, and I don't know if I sent it to you. I meant to, because it's amazing for someone. I was a writer like me or you. There are articles entitled "Words Don't Matter," and I'd like to send it to you, because I know I love seeing your eyes go like that, because of course words matter to us. But my point is that words don't matter because you can ignore them. I mean, words only matter if they have an impact. And of course, words don't matter is a mantra right now that's used for censoring. For words matter because they can offend. And the point is, if they offend, it's your choice. It's not the word. The words are not. They're both weapons and attackers. I'll send you the piece. But the interesting thing was, my attitude towards this partly, I think, comes from the fact that I came from a Jewish family, where the response to what might have been offense or subjugation, or whatever the word you might want to think, was always the response was always to do it better. I saw, Jews not being allowed in place X. What would they do? They build a better place. Why? And that was a totally different response than saying, "Oh my God, I can't do anything." And of course, there's a lot of reasons, and some of them were material ones for that. But you choose that attitude, and I think my response to the fact that the response to being offended is it feels sorry for the is to speak out and argue, but also to often, if someone says some ridiculous name, and nowadays where there's more anti-Semitism, even though I'm an atheist, people still nowadays start talking about the fact that I'm a Jew. Sometimes never used to happen, but my response is partly to therefore say they're not worth listening to, and also feel sorry for them because they're ignorant, but not to feel like I'm somehow victimized by that. And so you choose when it's verbal. I mean, it may be, there's many factors, and some of them are psychological, but it's you that's your psychological choice. If you're hit with a rock, you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But if you're hit with a word, you in some sense have a choice.
That's why in the War in the West, I used Nietzsche very carefully. As I always say, if you use Nietzsche, you need to use him carefully. But the genealogy of morals has this terrific insight that I borrow, which is his insight on the person of resentment. And I say that the only answer to resentment is gratitude. But and it's the passage in the War in the West I'm proudest of, is a chapter on gratitude. But I lead up to it by talking about Nietzsche's view of the person of resentment. And the person of resentment needs to have somebody stand over their life. And Nietzsche isn't quite sure who it would be, but describes it as a secular priest who stands over the life of the person seeped in resentment and says, there is a person responsible for your failings. There is a person who has ruined your life. The person is yourself.
Yeah.
Now, of course, nobody wants to be told that. It's about the most unpleasant thing you could ever be told, and nobody would want to be the person to tell somebody that.
Yeah.
But to give the positive spin on that, there's that beautiful interview that Morgan Freeman gave a few years ago, in which he said, I don't know why his interviews are so terrific, because he has such a sort of wonderful wisdom as well as a voice. And I think there's an interview he gave some years ago where the interviewer, who was also black, said, it's all very well for you to say that sort of thing, but some people can't get out of the place they're in and all this. And Morgan Freeman just says, that bus leaves every day. And it's such a beautiful thing to say. And at the very least, even if it wasn't true, it's a much better thing to hope is true than that there are no buses.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is, and of course, some people are limited in how many, if they're on the wrong route and the bus is on the other street. But so as I point out, when the example I gave for the Jews, well, they could afford to, the people I knew could afford to build a better place, and some people don't have those material things. But they nevertheless could, the other example was, of real. It's true that women weren't allowed in universities, but there was a quote on Jews in science in the United States, and Richard Feynman nearly didn't get into Princeton, only got in. I wrote a book about Feynman, only got in because when the chairman of the physics department at Princeton wrote the chairman at MIT said, "How Jewish is he?" And the chairman at MIT said, "Oh, he's not very Jewish. It's okay, let him in." But what happened in that field, which had a quota against Jews? What happened? Well, Feynman got in and was better than the others, and eventually led to, Sheldon Glashow and Stephen Weinberg. What happened is the Jews started becoming dominant because they could be, and so intellectually they chose to say will or whatever, and so there's lots of potential buses, and but we have to recognize that we have to make sure that, part of what you said early on is we have to make sure as a society that those bus stops exist, that people aren't held back by virtue of something they have no control over.
Absolutely. And at the very least, to recognize that, and I think, again, Morgan Freeman said this, but it's not the case in every country in the world by any means. If you're born in one of the lower castes in India, my God, there are no buses for you in this.
Yeah.
In America, it's not perfect by any means. In the West, it's not perfect, but there's nowhere else where it's better at the moment.
Well, that's your war. That gives us a brief 1-minute segment of the war in the West. While I have more segment about American imperialism than you are, perhaps, the statement that the West is criticized is often not put in proportion to the countries that aren't criticized for being worse, and I think that's a really important statement to make.
One of the oddities on the international stage,
Yeah.
Again, going back to Moynihan's law, the countries that have least human rights abuses will claim the citizenry will claim the most human rights abuses. And,
yeah, and you point out in that book how that's used against lately in diplomacy against the United States by places like China, saying, "Well, look what's happened with George Floyd and all that," and how you
we
dare
have
be
no
interested.
human rights complaints in China.
Yeah. So that's one area we agree about. Although I do think that American empire has not been as forgiving. But I don't want to talk about empire. I want to talk for 2 minutes about things we disagree with, and then I want to talk poetry. So, two things that clearly were wrong, in my opinion, were the invasion of Iraq, which I used to debate with my friend Christopher Hitchens, and Brexit. Give me 1 minute on each. Tell me why I'm stupid.
You're probably not wrong on Iraq. I've been asked to write a lot about it on the 20th anniversary, and I've actually insisted because I started writing something and it was so long. I just, anyhow, maybe another day.
Yeah.
It is so difficult. It was such a disaster in the end. Many people lost a lot of people, and it was hell for many of the people in the country, as well as for the troops. I don't think much was achieved. Some things were achieved. I'm not sorry to have seen the Husseins go.
No one's sorry about that. But let me frame this even clearer. It's obvious that it was a failure in a certain way. I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to get to the heart of this. That what bothers me more than it was a failure, because you never know unless you try. If there's a reason to try, what bothers me is at the time is that the rationale was a lie, that everyone knew that there weren't weapons, that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and that was to risk the lives of so many people for a lie is something.
Look, everyone apart from the British, American, German, and other intelligence agencies.
No, the Atomic Energy Agency was making. I was a physicist. It was quite clear. Everything I read suggested there was no evidence.
The official. I mean, there was inquiry into for instance, the Chilcot Commission in the UK and others. I mean, as I say, the German intelligence agency believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They were obviously against the war as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, as the Chilcot inquiry in Britain found, there was no. It would have been insane for Tony Blair to have knowingly lied about WMD, knowing that it would be discovered after the war there were none. I knew some of the main actors in the war, including slightly the person who your latest book titles lifted from.
Yes. And by the way, that's why they wouldn't let my America, my book is not called The Known Unknowns, because they felt that if I used a quote from Rumsfeld, it would be polarizing. In England, they didn't mind, so it's being used that in England.
Yeah, it was a great observation of his. But
it was one of. Look, the fact that I was not a fan of his doesn't mean he couldn't say anything intelligent. He certainly did.
But I mean, in the end, I think that there was terrible hubris. I think that many of us had the feeling that Afghanistan wasn't enough revenge for 9/11, and that America had the right to take out another enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And Saddam Hussein was the most intransigent, belligerent enemy of the US. And we also were. I mean, I spent time there after the initial invasion, and one of the reasons I'm way away still from having as settled opinion as I should have is because I saw things then that I mean, I can't be completely contrite. I was in northern Iraq when the Kurds celebrated their Nowruz, New Year's celebrations, one of the first times after the death of Saddam Hussein, and seeing these people all flood out of their houses and dancing in the hills was like something from Narnia. It was one of the most moving sights I've ever seen in my life, of people actually free for the first time. And I can never forget that, nor can I forget the torture chambers of Saddam Hussein that I saw, and knowing the stories of the people who are in them. And I suppose my own, for what it's worth, feeling in retrospect has simply been, and I certainly by Syria onwards had this view, that you have to be a lot more careful than we've been with ever altering status quos, because war is Pandora's box, and you can't put anything back in, and everything can happen. And I've
Yeah,
seen
and
enough.
generally war leads to suffering. I mean,
War
almost if
always
it's
leads
hard,
to
it's
suffering.
over. Diplomacy almost always works better than war, it seems to me.
Yes, except that sometimes the status quo is
Right.
actually as lethal as
Yeah,
ill. You just don't know. And
I
I,
agree.
I've but as I say, I have I'm very conflicted still on it. I think it was all disastrously handled and a tragedy, and yet I can't give up everything that
Yeah,
my.
I understand. I understand that conflict, the conflicted point of view there.
On
I
Brexit, I'm less conflicted.
Interesting.
I still believe it was the right thing to do. I never campaigned or anything like that because I'm not a campaigner. I wrote a long time beforehand why I thought that Britain was better off outside of the EU. I still think that to be the case, but we've had 7 years almost of complete ballsing of it up by consecutive British governments. And I think the electorate will throw out the Conservative Party at the next election, in part because they made such a balls up of the post-Brexit period. There were arguments for both sides. There was an argument for the status quo, that it was going to muck things up if we left. It was just too much hard work. I didn't believe that. I thought that sovereignty was more important. I still believe that. I still believe that in the end, as the socialist MP Tony Benn once said, there's a set of questions you need to ask anywhere you go in the world to any leader. Who put you here? Who can get you out? And so on. And by the way, Tony Benn rather never said that
Mm.
question when he met Saddam Hussein or most other leaders and despots around
Yeah.
the world. But anyway, put that aside for a second. The questions were good. And the question of who put you here and who can get rid of you wasn't very clear in my mind. It wasn't satisfactorily clear with the European Union and Britain. I thought that it was effectively anti-sovereignty, that we couldn't chuck out people who were making laws that overrode our laws, and that this was something that just needed to be righted. And personally, as I say, I think that was still correct. But there is no doubt that all of the things that we could have done, or many of the things we could have done in recent years, have been horribly wasted. Partly, largely through the bad governance of consecutive administrations of 4 prime ministers now. And they haven't taken advantage of the advantages of being out of the common market, and the fact that we didn't get any trade deal with the US, which we were trying to get under the Trump regime, Trump government, and didn't get in time, and now the Democrats won't give it to the UK anyway, is a blow. I mean, the hope was, and I think it was a justifiable hope, it's happened with Australia and others, but was that, we would leave the EU, remain on good terms with the EU, but also expand out to our older and closer Anglosphere allies. I don't think that was mad, but there's one apology I am willing to give on Brexit, which is that I am deeply sorry for the way in which many EU citizens viewed the vote. I wish that, and I actually said to the government in the days after Brexit, you have to tell EU citizens in the UK they are not a bargaining chip. They all have the right to stay. We want them. And to my great upset, the government listened and then didn't do what I asked. And I regret that, because I think it caused unnecessary bad blood and led to genuine and passionate misunderstandings of what the British people were actually saying with that vote.
Okay, good. I mean, look, I'm interested in your view. I have differing views in some areas, and I'll just put in 2 cents in each case. In response to what you said, when it comes to Iraq, I sympathize with everything you said, and I used to have this discussion with Christopher, so it's already softened me a little bit. But I am friends with someone whose politics I know you disagree with Noam Chomsky, and and uh, and and but I think he makes a number of interesting points, and several of which I think are valid. But one is, if you're allowed to remove, if you're allowed to remove governments you don't like, then it has to go both ways. And then you can't object when other governments want to remove you. And it's, what gives the United States the right to unilaterally decide what
Yeah.
And that's a
I-
question. Anyway, there's not an obvious answer to it. It's a question.
Well, there is an obvious answer. There is an obvious answer, which is that Noam Chomsky can never avoid being a relativist on absolutely everything. And personally speaking, I think that the government in Washington or London, or indeed even Paris, is more reliable in this regard than, say, the government in Pyongyang.
Yeah. Okay.
That's my answer to Mr. Chomsky.
That I would agree with. But I think the point is, you have to. I guess it comes back to what I said before. I think if one is going to risk millions of lives of people, as happened in Iraq, you have to have a better reason than just not liking Saddam Hussein, in my opinion. And in particular, I view it as also intelligent people cherry picked the information they wanted to be. It was the example of what's happened, what we've talked about in the book that you talk about. If you know the answer before you ask the question, you're going to get the answer you want. And if
By the way, I mean, there's also this huge. There was so much. I mean, partly the information we were fed by some Iraqi exile groups and so on. I mean, there was definitely a misunderstanding of the situation as it would be.
Then it's when it comes to breakfast, my rationale as an outsider are twofold. One, that I like going to London, but I also viewed it as being as far as I could tell, its economy was largely based on the fact that economically it was the entryway to Europe and I didn't think it was going to bode well economically for London to not be that. So from a partisan perspective, if I were there, I would have thought economically it's not necessarily going to be good news. But also as a scientist, if I looked, it seemed to me that England got more from more coming in from scientific support by being part of the EU than it gave out, and therefore I thought it would hurt the scientific community. So those were my two sort of personal perspectives of why it seemed to me like Brexit wasn't a good idea.
But on the second, I don't know if the data's in yet. On the first, there has been some drain, but nowhere near as much as people thought.
Yeah, apparently.
The city of London is still much superior to Frankfurt, where everyone was meant to flee.
Okay, now look, that was great. Now let's again end with the sublime, and after having left the ridiculous. There's two things I want to talk about, two poets briefly. You talked about Eliot, who happens to be one of my favorite poets, and there aren't a lot of poets I like, but T.S. Eliot is one, and there's few that I quote in my books, and I've quoted him in two. But I don't know if you want to. I should put you on the spot to recite the beginning of the four quartet that you like. Can you do that? And if not, I've it written down, but it's a beautiful.
The opening of four quartets is time present and time past are both perhaps contained in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been points to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, through the door we never opened, into the rose garden. And then he goes on, my words echo thus in your mind, disturbing the dust as on a bowl of rose leaves, but to what purpose I do not know. I've always been amazed by that last bit.
Yeah, that last bit. You didn't include it in your piece, but it's no. I mean, that quartet's really. I actually would have quoted it in the section on time. I have quotes, and one of the only reasons I did in my new book is it was logistic. The last time I quoted Eliot, I had to spend forever negotiating with the estate of T.S. Eliot for rights, and so I didn't put that in because I didn't want to take the time to.
You might know the answer to this. There's a word I've been searching for, which I came across years ago and have not since been able to discover, which is a word that actually describes what Eliot was so obsessed by about this thing of the nature of time, of all time being eternally present.
Yeah, it's the wave function of the universe, I think, the point is in quantum mechanics, if you think about it, the wave function of the universe is in space and time, and it basically contains all of time. It's a wave function. It basically says all of time is present. And certainly for a photon, it's all present for an instant. But in quantum mechanics, you can think of this, of time as an illusion, because you happen to separate things into these time slices. But in fact, in a picture of quantum mechanics, the whole history of the universe is part of a single wave function, and time is, it's like saying it's like space, which it is, and it's just present, just like all of space is present, all of time is present in one
I mean,
picture of the wave.
it's something which obsessed Eliot and has always deeply moved me. I mean, even at very early, I was in Boston the other day, and I suddenly remembered, and I said to my host that there's a weird early poem of Eliot's called the Boston Evening Transcript. The Boston Evening Transcript was a very dull-sounding newspaper that used to come out obviously every evening in Boston. And Eliot's very short poem about it is a beautiful piece of sort of bathos, apart from anything else. At the very end, he says something like, he says, and one would turn and nod, as one would nod to La Rochefoucauld if the street were time and he at the end of the street. And I said, Cousin Harriet, here is the Boston Evening Transcript. It's a wonderful idea. Boring evening paper, but the idea that one might be in a street in Boston and turn and there is La Rochefoucauld in the street. It's something he clearly had in his mind all his life.
Well, it's a fascinating concept. I mean, I talk about it in the first section of my new book is about time, of which there are many known unknowns about. And I point out that many people, including some physicists think time is an illusion in that sense. I think it's not an effect. I also point out, I don't think it's a very useful idea. It doesn't, saying time is an illusion doesn't mean a lot to someone who's missed the 5:50 train to a job interview. It may in some abstract sense mean that, but operationally, time is of vital importance in the universe. And so, anyway, I hope I sent you the PDF. I hope you read that chapter. But there's a lot we don't know about time. But the reason I brought that up, besides I love that, and I plan to actually, I've used certainly in places where I don't have to publish it. I have this in lectures because I love that part of Four Quartet. But the part of Four Quartet that I have quoted, which you don't use, is one that moved me much more than the time bit, which is interesting because as a writer and an English, you pick the part on time, which is in some sense vaguely scientific. I picked the part on words, and I loved his lines. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, and perish. Decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. And as a writer, every day I think of that poem because it's the struggle that I have every day.
It's a magnificent passage, that as well. I think it's also Burnt Norton, isn't it?
Yeah, it's also Burnt Norton. Yeah.
I mean, it's so true. And I mean, I realize whenever I lecture these days, increasingly how true it is that there are just words you use that have transmogrified in meaning in our own lifetimes, you know, and then you always get somebody who says, I was sorry you didn't spend more time explaining what you meant by X, and there is no time.
Yeah, there is no time for that. But I by the way, I began my piece on words don't matter with those words, with the quote from him, and another quote in the Burnt Norton, which also appears one line: "Words after speech reach into the silence," which is fascinating because for some people they do, but they only reach into the silence if you let them, I would argue.
Yes, well, Eliot believed that that poetry was a way to communicate with the dead. W.H. Auden once said that in an interview, which Seamus Heaney turned into a poem eventually in memory of Brodsky. Auden was once asked about what poetry was for, and he gave first of all Dr. Johnson's answer, and then said, I think off the cuff, he said, it's also our principal way to break bread with the dead.
Oh, wow.
And Eliot believes that. He says at the end of Four Quartets that what the dead couldn't tell us whilst living, they can tell us being dead.
Oh, okay. So I'm learning. That's why I wanted to bring it up. But I happen to love Eliot without being anywhere near as knowledgeable about him as you are. But the last one I want to end with, I think it's it's the one before this, one the week ago, is Rainer Maria Rilke,
Yes.
who you talk about, and actually I learned these little bits from, somehow eternity almost seems possible. What a beautiful thing. But what disappointed me is, and it's relevant, I think, the reason I wanted to end with it is as I think it's relevant to the discussion we have, and I'm nowhere near having encyclopedic knowledge of Rilke, but the bit that that stays with me is the four lines: "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." And I think for me, that captures the whole point of that's what it's all about with learning and not being offended and bouncing back. And I actually just sent that to my stepdaughter upon her graduating from college, because I think it's a beautiful, unbelievably beautiful sentiment. And
he was an extraordinary person, Rilke. And as I said in that piece, I mean, it could frame the great questions and some answers better than almost anyone.
yeah,
And such a touching figure, trying to ask these great questions at a time when the world had fallen around his ears,
yeah, and you
And
quote that great question: does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us all? That's one of the ones you quoted.
yes, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? I once said that to a mathematician friend who turned it round in his mouth and just said, "That's very good."
Now, I mean, I do enjoy, I'm learning from you and the poetry, because as I say, I'm a Philistine and I keep trying to learn a little more poetry. But I do want to, in the interest of full disclosure, first of all, lovely, say that I sound more in my knowledge of Rilke more scholarly than I am. Less people think I'm more scholarly. I learned those lines. Do you know where I learned the lines from Rilke? From the end of the movie Jojo Rabbit, where that appears that appears at the end of that movie.
Well, there's no shame in that. Whenever a mass communication medium like cinema encounters a very small communication medium like poetry is today, only good can come from it, is my view.
I think you're right. And only good can come, to go back to near the end of your book, to that face to face, as you point out, from de Tocqueville, that made democracy so good. The face to face that we've had here has been just delightful for me, and I just appreciate it so much. And I hope you enjoyed it too. And I know if people don't enjoy it, then there's something wrong.
It's been a great pleasure, Lawrence. I'm so pleased with you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century, and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.